Welcome, traveler, to forgotten worlds for sleep. Here, under the quiet rhythm of history's echo, we journey into stories that shaped our world, yet often fade from memory. Tonight, we ride across the endless grasslands of Mongolia, where a boy named Temüjin was born into hardship, rose through betrayal and struggle, and became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. His story is not only one of conquest, but of unity, innovation, and a vision that connected East and West centuries before our modern age. So close your eyes, let the winds of the steppe carry you back in time, and drift gently into sleep as we unfold the epic tale of the Mongol Empire, a story of resilience, power, and legacy, whispered through the ages. The Mongolian plateau of the 12th century was a land of extremes. Endless horizons stretched in every direction, windswept grasslands broken only by the occasional river, mountain ridge, or scattered gur of nomadic herders. Summers scorched the earth until it cracked and turned to dust. Winters came like an iron fist, plunging the steppe into weeks of frozen stillness, where temperatures could fall to 40 degrees below zero. Survival here required more than strength. It demanded adaptability, discipline, and an almost spiritual bond with horse and bow. It was into this unforgiving world, around the year 1162, that a child was born to Yasuji, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his wife Holan. The boy was given the name Temüjin, after a Tatar warrior whom Yasuji had once captured. His birth was marked by a strange omen. According to tradition, Temüjin entered the world grasping a blood clot tightly in his hand. Among the Mongols, this was interpreted as a sign of destiny, proof that the child would one day become a leader, a man of violence and power, destined to take life as easily as others drew breath. Temüjin's earliest years were shaped by both privilege and hardship. His father's position as a chieftain meant that he did not begin life as an outcast. Yasuji commanded a small but loyal following, and his family herds provided milk, meat, and felt for their tents. The young boy's first lessons were those of the steppe, learning to ride a horse before he could walk, knocking small arrows onto a child's bow, and listening to the stories of ancestors who claimed descent from the great blue wolf and the fabled doe of Mongol legend. But prosperity on the steppe was always fragile, built on shifting alliances between clans that could collapse with a single betrayal. When Temüjin was 9 years old, his father arranged a marriage for him with Borte, a girl from the powerful Anjurat tribe. According to custom, Temüjin was sent to live with Borte's family, to be raised among his future in-laws. It was during this time that fate struck a terrible blow. On his way home from delivering the boy, Yasuji accepted food from a band of Tatars. They recognized him as an old enemy and poisoned his meal. As he lay dying, Yasuji sent word to his followers to retrieve Temüjin, but by the time the child returned, his father was gone, and with him the fragile authority that had held their people together. Among the Mongols, leadership depended on charisma and strength. A clan would not follow a widow or a child. The Borjigin tribesmen deserted Holan and her children, leaving them destitute on the harsh steppe. Even the herds, lifeblood of survival, were taken away. Holan, once the wife of a respected leader, now found herself leading her small family into exile. This abandonment forged the steel in Temüjin's character. The boy who might have grown up in privilege was forced to survive by scraping roots from frozen ground, snaring marmots, and stitching together clothing from the skins of field mice. Hunger gnawed at him constantly, and the long winters tested his will to live. Yet he was not entirely alone. His mother, strong and resourceful, became the family's anchor. She drilled into her children the lesson that only unity could save them. A single arrow breaks easily, she told them, but a bundle of arrows cannot. Temüjin absorbed these words deeply. He learned that loyalty, above all else, was the currency of survival. He also learned another harsh lesson, that the bonds of blood could be as dangerous as those of strangers. When he was 12, a quarrel broke out between him and his half-brother Bektir over food and hunting spoils. In a moment of fury and desperation, Temüjin killed him. It was an act of fratricide, one of the gravest crimes in Mongol society, and a burden that would haunt him. But it also marked a turning point. From that day on, Temüjin asserted himself as the dominant figure in his family, willing to seize authority even through bloodshed. Yet the young boy's trials were far from over. Rival clans, once allies of his father, now saw him as weak prey. The Temüjin captured him and paraded him in a wooden collar, a humiliating symbol of bondage. For days he was dragged from camp to camp, mocked and displayed like a trophy. But fate had not finished with Temüjin. One night, during a drunken celebration, he broke free of his collar and slipped into the darkness. A man named Sorkinshira, seeing him hiding in the reeds of a river, chose not to betray him. This mercy, rare on the steppe, would not be forgotten. Later, when Temüjin rose to power, he rewarded Sorkinshira and his family with honor and wealth. The escape marked the beginning of Temüjin's transformation. He was no longer just a child of misfortune, but a survivor who had outlasted hunger, betrayal, captivity, and humiliation. His heart hardened, but his vision widened. He had seen how fragile loyalty was when it rested only on tribal bloodlines. He began to dream of something greater, a brotherhood not of birth, but of merit. By his early teens, Temüjin had already endured more than many men faced in a lifetime. He had buried his father, watched his family abandoned, killed his own brother, and escaped from slavery. The winds of the steppe had carved resilience into his bones. As he reunited with Borte, his betrothed, and began to forge alliances with tribes beyond his own, the foundation was laid for an empire that no one could yet imagine. The boy clutching a blood-clotted birth was becoming a man who would one day clutch the fate of nations in his hand. The Mongolian steppe was a place where loyalty could vanish as quickly as smoke on the wind. When Yasujii, Temüjin's father, fell to Tatar poison, the Borjigin clan dissolved its ties with his widow Holun and her children. To the warriors who had once ridden under Yasujii's banner, following a child was unthinkable. The bonds of allegiance snapped, and Temüjin's family was left abandoned, stripped of status, herds, and protection. The separation was merciless. Herd animals, the wealth and lifeblood of the nomad, were taken. Warriors who had once sworn oaths to Yasujii turned their backs. Even kin by blood declared they could not risk survival under a child's command. The deepest water dries up, the brightest stone crumbles, they said, excusing their betrayal with fatalistic proverbs. For Holun and her children, it was more than dishonor. It was a death sentence. Life on the margins of the steppe demanded endless struggle. Without herds of horses, sheep, or goats, Holun and her children became scavengers. They survived on berries, roots, and whatever game could be trapped with crude snares. In the harsh winters, they huddled together against the icy winds that cut through their felt shelter. Their clothing grew ragged, their bellies hollow. The same people who once drank fermented mare's milk in Yasujii's tent now passed by the widow's family as if they were ghosts. Yet Holun refused to collapse. A woman of unyielding will, she became the spine of the family. She led her children to rivers where fish could be caught, taught them to dig for edible plants, and stitched clothing from the skins of rodents when larger animals were beyond their reach. She did not shield them from the brutality of their situation. Instead, she carved resilience into them. Together we can withstand any storm, she would say, but a lone arrow breaks easily. For Temüjin, now a boy of 9 or 10, this abandonment was both a crucible and a revelation. He watched as his mother turned despair into determination. He learned that survival was possible not because of tribal ties or wealth, but because of discipline, courage, and loyalty to one's own family. In the emptiness left by betrayal, a new philosophy began to take shape in his young mind, one that would later redefine how an empire was ruled. Still, the hardships were relentless. Hunger often drove the children into desperate quarrels. Temüjin's half-brother, Bedtime, older and stronger, increasingly challenged his authority. Bekters sometimes withheld food or asserted dominance over their sisters, provoking fierce resentment. The tension built like a storm until, one day, Temüjin and his younger brother Khazar struck Bektar down with arrows. This act of fratricide was more than a family tragedy. In Mongol culture, killing kin was among the gravest sins. It meant Temüjin had crossed a line that could not be erased. Yet in his mind, the act was a necessity, a brutal assertion of leadership, a declaration that he, not Bektar, would carry their family forward. The boy who had been abandoned by his clan had chosen to seize authority, even at the cost of blood. But the dangers of isolation went beyond hunger and internal strife. Rival tribes prowled the grasslands like wolves, quick to prey on the weak. One such clan, the Temüjin, captured Temüjin when he was still a boy. They shackled him in a heavy wooden collar, a degrading symbol of slavery, and paraded him from yurt to yurt. Villagers jeered and mocked him, marveling at the once proud chieftain's son reduced to a spectacle. For days he endured humiliation, the weight of the collar cutting into his shoulders, his dignity ground into dust. Yet Temüjin did not break. Watching the men who mocked him, he memorized their faces, their cruelty, and their weaknesses. He was learning not only about endurance, but about the character of men, about when mercy mattered and when ruthlessness would rule. One night, during a festival when his guards were distracted, Temüjin seized his chance. He smashed the collar against a rock and fled into the darkness. Pursued across the steppe, he plunged into the shallows of a river, hiding among reeds. A man named Sorkinshira discovered him. In that moment, fate could have ended Temüjin's story with the betrayal, but instead, the man chose silence. He let the boy live. This single act of mercy left a scar of gratitude on Temüjin's soul that he would never forget. The escape restored him to his family, but it did not erase their hardships. They remained poor, wandering the steppe with no herds, dependent on their mother's ingenuity and their own endurance. Yet something within Temüjin had shifted. The boy who had been abandoned, betrayed, and enslaved was no longer merely a victim. He was becoming a leader, forged by fire and sharpened by necessity. It was in this crucible of suffering that the seeds of empire were sown. Temüjin learned that power came not from noble birth or tribal name, but from loyalty, unity, and the will to survive against impossible odds. He had lived the bitter truth of Mongol life, that only the strong endured, and only the adaptable rose above fate. The child once left to starve on the margins of the world was already envisioning something greater, a brotherhood beyond bloodlines, a force bound not by family, but by trust and ability. The boy who had scavenged roots and berries was beginning to imagine how he might one day command men, bend tribes to his will, and transform his family's despair into the foundation of destiny. Temüjin had been betrayed, stripped of wealth, and cast into poverty. Yet in the ashes of this ruin, he was learning the lessons that would make him Genghis Khan. By the time Temüjin reached his early teens, the brutal realities of life on the Mongolian steppe had already carved scars into his soul. Hunger, abandonment, and constant danger shaped every day. But among the trials of his youth, one act would leave a deeper shadow than any other. The killing of his half-brother, Bektar. The quarrel had simmered for months. Bektar, older and stronger, often used his authority to claim food and hunting spoils for himself. In a family living on the knife edge of survival, every scrap of meat, every bone boiled for broth, meant the difference between life and death. Temüjin, though still young, had begun to see himself as protector of his siblings and heir to his father's legacy. To endure Bektar's domination, to let him take what belonged to all, was intolerable. One day, in a heated dispute, Temüjin and his younger brother Khazar resolved to act. They stalked Bektar, bows in hand, and unleashed their arrows. The shaft struck true. Their half-brother collapsed, lifeless on the cold earth. Among Mongols, fratricide was not just a crime, it was a curse. Killing a brother meant breaking one of the most sacred bonds. For Temüjin, the act was both necessity and nightmare. He had secured his role as head of the family, but the guilt would remain with him forever. It was a reminder that leadership on the steppe was never clean. It was paid for in blood. Yet even this dark deed did not shield him from further trials. Not long after Begner's death, the family's precarious life caught the attention of rivals. The Temüjin, once allies of his father, now saw an opportunity to crush the boy before he could rise. Temüjin was captured. His captors wasted no time in degrading him. They locked his neck in a heavy wooden collar, so wide he could not lie down comfortably or raise food to his mouth without help. He was paraded from one yurt to another, mocked and jeered by those who had once feared his father's name. Villagers laughed as the proud chieftain's son stumbled under the collar's weight, reduced to a pitiful spectacle. For days he endured humiliation, hunger, and exhaustion, but while his body suffered, his spirit sharpened. Temüjin observed his captors closely. He noted who showed cruelty for its own sake, who was indifferent, and who displayed unexpected kindness. Even in bondage, he was studying men, their strengths, their weaknesses, their nature. It was a skill that would later define his rule, the ability to weigh character as carefully as he weighed the draw of a bow. One evening, during a celebration, the guards grew drunk and careless. The camp echoed with laughter, music, and the clinking of bowls filled with fermented mare's milk. Temüjin, though weakened, saw his chance. Slipping from the shadows, he lifted the collar and slammed it against a rock until it cracked. Splinters flew, and for the first time in days, his neck was free. He fled into the night, but the steppe was not forgiving. Pursuit was swift. Warriors combed the riverbanks and grasslands, searching for the escaped boy. At one point, Temüjin crouched in the reeds of a shallow stream, water biting at his skin. His breath held as hooves thundered nearby. A man named Sorkinshira, one of the Temüjin, spotted him. The moment was suspended like an arrow drawn taut. Sorkinshira could have shouted, could have earned honor by delivering the fugitive back to his captors. Instead, he chose silence. Whether out of pity, respect, or some intuition of destiny, he allowed the boy to live. That single act of mercy seared itself into Temüjin's memory. Years later, when he commanded armies and ruled vast lands, he would seek out Sorkinshira and reward him with wealth and honor. In a world where cruelty was common, Temüjin never forgot a kindness. Rejoining his family after the escape, Temüjin carried both shame and resolve. He had killed his own brother, and he had known the humiliation of captivity. But he had also discovered within himself an iron resilience. He had survived isolation, betrayal, and bondage. The boy who had been mocked as a helpless captive was now a young man, hardened by experience. Around this time, he reunited with Borte, his betrothed. Their marriage was not only personal but political. It bound him to her tribe, the Anjurat, and gave him his first fragile network of support. As a wedding gift, he received a black sable coat, a treasure of immense value. Temüjin, unlike most, did not hoard it. He understood that gifts could forge alliances. Soon, he would carry the coat to Togrul, Khan of the Kharait, and offer it in exchange for his protection. The boy who had once scavenged roots and berries was beginning to think like a leader. He knew that survival on the steppe required more than strength. It demanded allies, and allies were won not by blood alone, but by trust, by loyalty, and sometimes by sacrifice. Temüjin's youth had already taught him that the world was a harsh teacher. Brothers could become enemies. Tribes could betray widows and orphans. Captivity could crush a man or forge him into something stronger. He had chosen the latter. The boy who escaped from a wooden collar was no longer merely a victim of fate. He was becoming Temüjin the survivor, Temüjin the strategist, the man who would one day rise from poverty and humiliation to claim the title of Genghis Khan. When Temüjin reunited with Borte, the girl to whom he had been betrothed since childhood, it was more than a marriage. It was the first spark of political power. Borte came from the Anjurat tribe, respected and influential on the Mongolian steppe. Their union was not merely the fulfillment of an old arrangement made by their fathers. It was a calculated step forward for a young man who had tasted betrayal and poverty and now sought stability. The wedding was modest, far from the grand celebrations of wealthier tribes, but it bound Temüjin to a larger network of allies. Borte herself was more than a symbol of alliance. Intelligent, resilient, and steadfast, she would become his lifelong companion and advisor. In a world where wives were often seen as prizes or hostages, Borte stood as a partner. Temüjin, who had seen the strength of his mother, Holun, valued such qualities. As part of the marriage, Borte's family gifted Temüjin a black sable coat. It was no ordinary garment. It was wealth embodied, a treasure that could serve as currency or bribe, the kind of gift fit for Khans. Most men would have guarded it jealously, a rare token of prestige in a life otherwise marked by hardship. But Temüjin saw in it an opportunity greater than personal luxury. He remembered his father's friendship with Togrul, Khan of the Karite, one of the most powerful tribes of the steppe. Yasujii and Togrul had once sworn Anda, blood brotherhood, a sacred bond of loyalty. If Temüjin could revive that connection, he might gain the protection and support he needed to rise above his family's obscurity. With this in mind, he rode to Togrul's camp, carrying the sable coat across the windswept plains. The Karite Khan received him with curiosity. Temüjin, still a young man, presented the coat with humility, but also with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the value of his offering. "This," Temüjin declared, laying the coat before the Khan, "is my pledge to you. I will be your right hand. Together, we will unite the people of the felt tents." Togrul was impressed. The young man's boldness echoed the spirit of his late father. Accepting the coat, he clasped Temüjin's hand and agreed to support him. It was the beginning of an alliance that would shape the future of the steppe. But fate tested Temüjin almost immediately. The Merkits, old enemies of his family, had not forgotten the abduction of his mother, Holun, years earlier. Seeking revenge, they struck swiftly, raiding Temüjin's camp and seizing Borte. She was carried away into captivity, just as his mother had once been. For Temüjin, the loss was devastating, but where others might have accepted despair, he saw an opportunity to prove himself as a leader. Rallying his small band of followers, he rode to Togrul and reminded the Khan of their pact. Togrul agreed to lend warriors. Temüjin also sought aid from Jamuka, his childhood companion and blood brother, whose friendship remained strong at that time. With their combined forces, Temüjin launched his first true military campaign. It was no small feat. He was still a young leader, unproven in large-scale battle. Yet his planning, persistence, and charisma brought warriors to his side. The campaign succeeded. Borte was rescued after months of captivity, though she returned carrying a child whose paternity would forever remain uncertain. Temüjin, however, made a choice that revealed his character. He accepted the boy, Joki, as his own. In doing so, he demonstrated pragmatism and vision. For Temüjin, what mattered was not blood but loyalty, not the accident of birth, but the strength of bonds. It was the same principle that had kept his family alive in exile, unity above all. This decision, radical for its time, foreshadowed the meritocracy that would later define his empire. The victory against the Merkits elevated Temüjin's reputation. Word spread across the steppe that the son of Yasujii was no longer a forgotten exile, but a leader capable of rallying allies, defeating enemies, and rescuing his own. Men who had once dismissed him began to take notice. Ambitious warriors from weaker clans sought his banner, drawn not by blood ties, but by the promise of advancement through skill and loyalty. This was Temüjin's true innovation, where other chieftains clung to aristocratic privilege, favoring their kin and nobles. Temüjin offered something revolutionary: opportunity for anyone, even former enemies, so long as they proved themselves worthy. The poor and the marginalized, the sons of shepherds and servants, found in him a chance to rise higher than tradition would ever allow. It was not without risk. His vision put him at odds with traditionalists like Jamuka, who still valued lineage and aristocratic entitlement. But for now, their friendship endured, and together they stood against greater enemies. Temüjin had begun to transform his personal survival story into the beginnings of power. With Borte returned, an alliance with Togul secured, and his reputation growing, he was no longer merely a survivor of betrayal and captivity. He was a young leader forging his path, learning that alliances and loyalty were weapons as sharp as any blade. The Black Sable Code had been more than a gift. It had been the seed of empire. The rescue of Borte had given Temüjin his first taste of victory, and with it came a new sense of destiny. He was no longer a boy struggling to survive in poverty, nor a captive mocked by rivals. He was a leader, forging alliances and wielding them to win battles. But as his power grew, so too did the shadows of rivalry, especially with Jamuka, the boyhood friend who had once been as close as a brother. For a time, their bond seemed unbreakable. Both had sworn a blood brotherhood in their youth, a sacred vow that bound men as tightly as kin. Jamuka was charismatic, bold, and descended from an aristocratic lineage that commanded respect. Temüjin, by contrast, was pragmatic, hardened by survival, and already beginning to attract warriors from humble origins who saw in him a leader willing to judge them on skill, not birth. Together, they launched campaigns against rival tribes, sharing victories and spoils. Their forces grew, their reputation spread. To many on the steppe, the two men seemed destined to rule side by side, a partnership that could bring unity to the fragmented Mongol world. But unity on the steppe was a fragile dream. Beneath the surface, their visions of leadership diverged. Jamuka clung to tradition. He believed that aristocratic families, the noble lineages of the Mongols, had a divine right to command. To him, Temüjin's practice of promoting warriors based on loyalty and ability, regardless of rank, was dangerous and insulting. Temüjin saw it differently. His own life had proven that noble birth meant nothing without strength, discipline, and trust. He had been abandoned by his clan, betrayed by those of noble blood. What had saved him was his mother's teaching, his siblings' loyalty, and his own resilience. To him, true power lay not in lineage, but in unity forged through earned trust. The rift widened. Temüjin's camp began attracting men from lower status clans, shepherds, artisans, and warriors tired of aristocratic arrogance. These men saw in him not only a chance to fight, but a chance to rise. Jamuka, meanwhile, retained the allegiance of many noble families who viewed Temüjin as a threat to their privileges. The break came suddenly. Around the year 1186, Temüjin called a Kurultai, a council of tribal leaders, and was declared Khan by his followers. It was an unprecedented moment. He was not of the most powerful lineage, yet he had been elevated because of his ability to inspire loyalty. To Jamuka, this was a betrayal. To the aristocrats, it was an outrage. The friendship shattered. Jamuka raised his own standard and declared war. Where once they had stood as brothers, now they prepared to face one another as enemies. The first clash was brutal. Temüjin's army numbered around 20,000, disciplined and organized under his meritocratic system. Jamuka, however, commanded nearly twice as many men, 30,000, drawn from the great aristocratic clans. The odds were stacked against Temüjin. At first, his smaller force fought with the skill and precision he demanded, holding their ground against superior numbers. But Jamuka was ruthless. Capturing 70 of Temüjin's men, he ordered them executed in the most gruesome way imaginable by boiling them alive. It was an act of calculated terror, a message to all who might consider betraying noble tradition for Temüjin's vision of merit. The defeat was devastating. Temüjin's followers scattered. His family fled for survival. Yet from this catastrophe, a lesson was carved deep into his soul. Mercy could be a tool, but ruthlessness was sometimes necessary to hold power. Jamuka had shown him that terror was as much a weapon as the bow or sword. Temüjin would never forget it, but even in defeat, his reputation grew. Those who survived saw not only the brutality of Jamuka, but also the resilience of Temüjin. They remembered that he fought for them, not because of their lineage, but because of their loyalty. Gradually, the tide would shift. Over the next years, more and more warriors deserted Jamuka's aristocratic camp to join Temüjin, drawn to his vision of leadership that rewarded courage and discipline above bloodlines. The rivalry between Temüjin and Jamuka would stretch for nearly 2 decades, a cycle of alliances, betrayals, and battles that would define the future of the steppe. They had once sworn to be brothers, but in the end, there could be only one Khan. In these years of struggle, Temüjin's leadership style hardened. He began to build not just a warband, but the skeleton of a nation. He insisted on order in his camps, outlawing theft and violence among his followers. He began experimenting with the decimal military system, organizing his men into units of 10, 100, and 1,000. This structure would one day become the backbone of the greatest cavalry force the world had ever seen. Yet behind every innovation was the memory of betrayal. He had seen his clan abandon his family, seen a blood brother turn into a rival, seen cruelty deployed as a weapon. From these lessons, Temüjin forged his creed: loyalty above all, discipline without exception, and rewards based on merit. The boy who had once scavenged roots to survive was now becoming a commander, a man capable of dreaming beyond the narrow boundaries of tribal politics. But to realize that dream, he would have to defeat Jamuka once and for all. The steppe was too small for 2 Khans. The Mongolian steppe had always been a land of shifting loyalties, where alliances formed with the rising of the sun and shattered before nightfall. But the rivalry between Temüjin and Jamuka was not just another feud between tribal leaders. It was a struggle for the very soul of the Mongol people, whether power would remain chained to aristocratic bloodlines or be redefined by merit, loyalty, and discipline. For nearly 20 years, their conflict ebbed and flowed like the endless winds across the plains. Some years Temüjin's star seemed to ascend, as his meritocratic vision drew men from humble clans who longed for opportunity. In other years, Jamuka's greater numbers, bolstered by the aristocracy, forced Temüjin into retreat. It was not one war, but many, a saga of battles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances that tested both men to their limits. After Temüjin's defeat and Jamuka's horrifying execution of 70 prisoners by boiling, many might have thought the younger leader finished. But instead, Temüjin rebuilt, piece by piece. He sought out tribes dissatisfied with aristocratic dominance, promising them fair treatment and advancement for their best warriors. He imposed strict order on his followers, forbidding theft, punishing betrayal, and rewarding loyalty with shares of plunder. Slowly, men who valued justice over privilege began to flock to his banner. Jamuka, though charismatic, ruled in the old way, rewarding kin and noble birth, disregarding the common warrior. Over time, his arrogance drove some of his followers into Temüjin's camp. To the poor and lowborn, Jamuka represented the suffocating past, while Temüjin offered the possibility of a future shaped by courage and loyalty. The steppe became divided into 2 visions of leadership. Families and clans were torn apart as brothers chose different banners. Entire tribes split down the middle, some riding with Jamuka, others swearing allegiance to Temüjin. At times, the conflict seemed less like war between 2 men, and more like a civil war for the identity of the Mongol nation. One of Temüjin's greatest strengths in these years was his ability to forge alliances beyond blood. He courted Togrul, Khan of the Karite, reminding him of the blood brotherhood once shared with Yasujii, Temüjin's father. Togrul became both mentor and ally, offering warriors to support Temüjin's cause. For a time, this alliance gave Temüjin a powerful base. But even alliances born in loyalty could not withstand the constant strain of power. Temüjin's growing strength eventually alarmed Togrul, who feared being overshadowed by his young protege. Their relationship, once a pillar of Temüjin's rise, soured into suspicion. By 1203, the two would become bitter enemies, their armies clashing in battles that left the steppe littered with corpses. Through it all, Jamuka remained Temüjin's most personal rival. Theirs was not merely a struggle for supremacy, but a tragic drama of friendship turned to enmity. They had once sworn brotherhood, sharing meals, victories, and dreams. Now they hunted one another across the plains, each betrayal deepening the chasm between them. Temüjin's discipline and vision gave him an edge that Jamuka could never fully counter. Even in defeat, his followers did not abandon him. They trusted him to return stronger, to reward loyalty when victory came. He learned to bide his time, striking when his enemies grew complacent, retreating when the odds were against him. His campaigns were less about single decisive battles and more about steady attrition, weakening enemies, forming new alliances, absorbing defectors. One story from these years illustrates the difference between the two men. After capturing some of Jamuka's warriors, Temüjin did not execute them in cruelty, as Jamuka had done to his followers. Instead, he offered them places in his ranks, provided they swore loyalty. Many accepted, seeing in him a leader more just and far-sighted than their old master. It was a practical policy, but also a moral one. Temüjin valued men not for their bloodline, but for their ability to serve faithfully. Still, the struggle was long and brutal. Temüjin's family often lived on the edge of ruin, forced to flee across the plains, pounded by enemies. His wife Borte endured repeated dangers. His children grew up amid constant war, and his followers faced years of hardship. Yet in those hardships, the bonds between leader and follower grew strong as iron. By the turn of the 13th century, the balance had shifted. Temüjin's system of merit and loyalty was proving more durable than Jamuka's reliance on aristocratic privilege. Bit by bit, tribe by tribe, Temüjin absorbed his enemies and built a following unlike any seen before on the steppe. In time, Jamuka's power waned. Betrayed by his own followers, he was eventually captured and delivered to Temüjin. The moment was heavy with history. Here was the man who had once been a blood brother, then a bitter enemy. Temüjin, remembering their youthful bond, offered reconciliation, but Jamuka refused. He asked instead for a noble death without bloodshed, as befitted a prince of the steppe. Temüjin granted his wish. Jamuka's back was broken, his body buried with honor. It was the final act in a rivalry that had shaped Temüjin's rise. With his greatest rival gone, the steppe lay open before him. But his ambition did not end with victory over Jamuka. For Temüjin, the unification of the Mongol tribes was not merely a goal, it was a destiny. The war between brothers had ended, but the war for the world was about to begin. The death of Jamuka closed one chapter of Temüjin's life, but opened another far greater. For years, he had fought not only to survive, but to define a new kind of leadership, one built on loyalty and merit rather than aristocratic privilege. Now, with his greatest rival gone, he stood on the threshold of something no Mongol before him had achieved, the unification of the steppe. Yet the road to unity was not swift. The Mongolian plateau remained a patchwork of clans and tribes, Temüjin, Naiman, Merkit, Tatars, and many others. Each guarded its independence fiercely. The old cycles of alliance, betrayal, and revenge had hardened into tradition. For centuries, no one had been able to hold all the tribes together for more than a fleeting season. To attempt such a thing was to challenge the very fabric of steppe life. Temüjin's answer was simple, but radical. He would break those traditions. No longer would warriors be bound by bloodline alone. Instead, men would be organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These groups were not formed by family ties, but by discipline and trust. It was the birth of the decimal system of organization, a military and social revolution. This structure did more than create efficiency. It dissolved tribal divisions. A man might find himself in the same unit as strangers from distant clans, but under Temüjin's rule, they would fight, eat, and share plunder together. Over time, loyalty shifted from tribe to unit, from lineage to leader. Temüjin was not merely building an army, he was building a nation. To maintain order in this new system, Temüjin codified his authority through a body of laws known as the Yasa. These decrees covered everything from military discipline to the treatment of women, the division of spoils, and the punishment for betrayal. Theft was forbidden. Desertion was punishable by death. But mercy was also woven into the code. Those who surrendered were often spared, artisans were valued, and religious leaders were protected. The Yasa became the backbone of Temüjin's authority, uniting people of different clans under one law. Still, the path was marked by struggle. The powerful Naiman Confederation, proud and wealthy, opposed him. At the Battle of Naku, Temüjin's forces clashed with theirs in a ferocious contest. His disciplined cavalry outmaneuvered the Naiman, encircling and shattering their ranks. The Naiman Khan fell, and his people were absorbed into Temüjin's growing coalition. The Tatars, longtime enemies of his family, were crushed in a campaign that avenged his father's poisoning decades earlier. Entire clans were decimated, their leaders executed, their warriors absorbed into his ranks. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with annihilation, but loyalty would be rewarded. Temüjin's victories were not only military but political. He forged alliances with lesser clans by offering stability and justice, something rare on the lawless steppe. Under his protection, trade caravans could travel more safely. Families who had once lived in fear of raids began to look to Temüjin as a guarantor of order. Gradually, he replaced chaos with authority. The steppe began to change. Where once every chieftain had dreamed only of survival, now warriors whispered of something greater, a vision of unity under one leader. For the first time, it seemed possible that the endless cycle of raids and betrayals could end. By 1206, the transformation was complete. Temüjin summoned the tribes to a great Kurultai, a council of leaders, near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldan. Warriors, chieftains, and nobles gathered from across the steppe. They had fought him, resisted him, even betrayed him. Yet now, standing before him, they acknowledged what had become undeniable. Temüjin had triumphed. He had achieved what no other Mongol had ever done. In a solemn ceremony, he was lifted on a felt carpet and proclaimed Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the universal leader, the boy who had once been abandoned to starvation, the captive mocked in a wooden collar, the outcast who killed his own brother, now stood as master of the Mongol nation. At 44 years of age, Genghis Khan had united the tribes of the steppe. His childhood of hunger and betrayal had forged him into a leader unlike any other. His laws and military system had bound the fractious clans into a single force, and his vision reached far beyond the Mongolian plateau. For standing before the assembled leaders, Genghis Khan declared, "I have risen from the brown earth to the throne of gold. I intend to bring the entire world beneath the hoofbeats of our horses." The steppe was no longer enough. His eyes turned south to the rich kingdoms of China, west to the Muslim empires of Central Asia, and further still to the lands of distant Europe. The age of tribal feuds was over. The age of conquest had begun. The spring of 1206 was unlike any other on the Mongolian plateau. Across the vast grasslands, smoke from hundreds of campfires spiraled into the clear blue sky. Warriors gathered from every corner of the steppe, their horses tethered in long rows, their felt tents dotting the valleys near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldan. It was here, after decades of strife and bloodshed, that a new order would be proclaimed. This was no ordinary gathering of clans. It was a Kurultai, a great assembly of the Mongol nation. For generations, such councils had been used to decide leadership, forge alliances, or prepare for war. But never had the stakes been so high. The warriors who came were not only representatives of their clans, they were witnesses to history. At the heart of the gathering stood Temüjin. He was no longer the orphan boy abandoned by his father's followers, nor merely the ambitious chieftain who had clawed his way to prominence. He had defeated the Tatars, crushed the Naiman, humbled the Merkid, and outmaneuvered his blood brother-turned-rival Jamuka. One by one, the tribes had submitted, some willingly, others through sheer force. The plateau was his. The ceremony began with solemn rituals. Shamanic chants rose into the wind, calling upon Tungri, the eternal blue sky. To bless the gathering, horses were sacrificed, their blood offered to the heavens as a symbol of unity between earth and sky. Then, with great ceremony, Temüjin was raised on a felt carpet and lifted high by the hands of his generals and allies. In that moment, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, destined to command not merely the Mongols, but, in time, all peoples. The title was more than a name. It was a declaration of intent. Genghis Khan was no longer just a leader of a clan or even a confederation. He was the sovereign of a nation unlike any the steppe had ever known. Yet a proclamation alone could not hold the tribes together. Genghis Khan understood that if his empire were to endure, it needed structure, law, and vision. In the weeks following his enthronement, he unveiled a series of sweeping reforms that transformed the Mongol nation from a collection of wandering clans into a disciplined state. The cornerstone was the decimal system of organization. Every man was placed into a unit of 10, commanded by a leader chosen not by birth, but by merit. 10 of these formed 100, 10 hundreds formed 1,000, and 10 thousands formed a tumen. This structure cut across tribal lines, dissolving centuries of inherited rivalries. A man's loyalty was no longer to his bloodline alone, but to his unit and to his Khan. Alongside this came the Yasa, a body of laws proclaimed as the eternal code of the empire. The Yasa established order where once there had been only custom and violence. Theft was punished severely. Adultery could mean death. But the laws also protected the weak. Women could not be sold into marriage against their will, and children were not to be harmed in warfare. All religions were declared equal under the Khan's rule. Priests, shamans, monks, and imams were granted exemption from taxation and conscription, ensuring the loyalty of the spiritual class. Discipline was strict, but rewards were generous. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could rise through the ranks regardless of their origins. Loot was shared according to fixed rules, preventing quarrels that had destroyed alliances in the past. Artisans, smiths, and engineers captured in war were not executed, but incorporated into the empire's service. Every skill had value under Genghis Khan. The Kurultai also formalized the governing council. Trusted generals and advisors, men like Subutai the Valiant, Jeeb the Arrow, and Macaulay, were elevated into positions of command. They would not only lead armies, but administer territories, enforce laws, and collect tribute. In return, they swore absolute loyalty to the Khan, who bound them with rewards, marriages, and oaths. This transformation was as cultural as it was political. For centuries, the steppe had known only the endless cycle of raid and retaliation. Now, under Genghis Khan, a vision emerged of something greater. An empire that could endure, expand, and impose order not only on the steppe, but beyond it. The gathering at Burkhan Khaldun lasted for weeks. Feasting and games celebrated the new order, but beneath the joy lay a sense of destiny. The warriors who had once fought each other now sat side by side, drinking fermented mare's milk from shared bowls, toasting the Khan, who had united them. Old grievances were not forgotten, but they were set aside in the name of something larger. When at last the Kurultai ended, the Mongols dispersed across the plateau, not as fractured tribes, but as soldiers of a single nation. And in the heart of every warrior burned the Khan's words, spoken before the assembly. I will unite the Felten people. I will bring order where there has been none, and I will bring the entire world under the eternal blue sky. The boy born clutching a blood clot had fulfilled the prophecy of his birth. But he was not content to rest. The Mongol steppe was united. Now his gaze turned outward, toward the rich kingdoms of China, the powerful Muslim states of Central Asia, and the distant empires of the West. The Kurultai of 1206 had crowned him universal ruler. The world beyond the steppe had no idea of the storm that was coming. When the dust of the Kurultai of 1206 had settled, and Genghis Khan stood as the unchallenged ruler of the Mongols, he wasted no time in testing his new war machine. To prove the strength of his newly forged nation, he looked south, toward a kingdom that had long underestimated the steppe tribes, the Western Xia. The Tangut state of Western Xia was no small prize. Nestled between the Gobi Desert and the Yellow River, It controlled fertile oases, key Silk Road trade routes, and heavily fortified cities. Its rulers were wealthy, cultured, and proud. To them, the Mongols were little more than horse-riding raiders from the north, dangerous but disorganized, and incapable of taking stone-walled cities. That assumption was about to be shattered. In 1207, Genghis Khan launched probing raids into Tangut territory. These were not mere border raids, but deliberate tests of his army's adaptability. Steppe warfare had always been mobile, favoring ambushes and lightning strikes, but sedentary kingdoms relied on cities, walls, and fortifications that nomads rarely conquered. If the Mongols were to expand beyond the steppe, they needed to master siege warfare. Genghis Khan moved with careful preparation. He ordered the recruitment of Chinese engineers captured during earlier raids, forcing them to teach his men how to build siege engines, trebuchets, catapults, and rammed earth towers. Technologies once foreign to the steppe now began to appear in Mongol camps. Artisans who knew how to cast metal, shape stone, or design fortifications were spared and set to work. The Khan's vision was not of destruction alone, but of transformation. Every conquered skill would be absorbed into the empire's arsenal. The campaign began in earnest in 1209. The Mongol army, numbering perhaps 60,000, advanced into Tangut lands in a coordinated wave. Scouts rode ahead to map terrain and cut supply lines. Columns of warriors fanned out, striking smaller settlements and forcing them into submission. Those who resisted were destroyed without mercy. Those who surrendered were absorbed into the Mongol war machine. The Tanguts were astonished by the discipline and precision of the invaders. Unlike other nomadic raiders, these warriors did not scatter once they had looted. Instead, they moved in tightly organized units, obeying every command, fighting as if bound by a single mind. One by one, Tangut strongholds fell. At the fortress city of Wulahai, Mongol trebuchets hurled stones that smashed through walls. The defenders fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by the sheer relentlessness of the attackers. Genghis Khan's strategy was not merely brute force, it was psychological. He allowed survivors to flee, spreading tales of Mongol power and cruelty, ensuring that the next city would tremble even before the first arrow flew. The Tangut ruler, Emperor Xiangzong, attempted to resist. He gathered a large army, relying on heavily armored cavalry and fortified lines. But the Mongols' mobility was unmatched. Feigned retreats drew Tangut forces into ambushes. Showers of arrows darkened the sky, breaking formations before the killing charge of lances and sabers. Again and again, the Tanguts were outmaneuvered. After months of relentless campaigning, the Tanguts realized they could not win on the battlefield. Their walls had slowed the invaders, but not stopped them. Their armies had been bled dry, their cities encircled. In the winter of 1209 to 1210, with Mongol forces closing in on the capital of Yinchuan, Emperor Xiangzong finally submitted. The terms of submission were harsh but pragmatic. The Tanguts acknowledged Genghis Khan as their overlord, agreed to pay tribute in goods and soldiers, and pledged military support for future campaigns. In return, their kingdom was allowed to survive, its cities spared from destruction. Genghis Khan understood the value of vassals. The Western Xia would serve as both a buffer state and a resource pool for the Mongol war machine. For the Khan, this was more than a victory. It was proof that the Mongols could not only dominate the steppe but also defeat settled, fortified civilizations. The psychological impact was immense. Across China, whispers spread. The horsemen of the north had mastered siege warfare. No city was truly safe. The Western Xia campaign also demonstrated Genghis Khan's strategic vision. Unlike other conquerors who looted and withdrew, he built systems that endured. He left garrisons to monitor trade routes. He integrated captured engineers and artisans into his empire. He demanded tribute not just in gold but in knowledge, skills, and soldiers. Every conquest was a stepping stone to the next. Yet beneath the triumph, the Tangut submission was not the end of the story. The Western Xia would serve the Mongols faithfully for years, but their loyalty was never wholehearted. In later decades, as the empire expanded, the Tanguts would defy the Khan one last time, a decision that would bring about their ultimate annihilation. For now, however, Genghis Khan had accomplished his first great conquest beyond the steppe. The tribes were united, the Tanguts humbled, and the Mongol war machine had proven itself against walls of stone. The eternal blue sky had granted its favor, and the Khan's ambitions grew ever bolder. Beyond the Western Xia lay the true prize, the Jin dynasty of northern China, with its vast wealth, massive cities, and standing army of more than 1 million soldiers. To test his empire, the Khan had struck at the Tanguts. To announce himself to the world, he would strike at the Jin. By 1211, Genghis Khan had tested his new empire against the Tanguts and found victory. But he knew that true legitimacy as a world conqueror required more than raiding border states. To the south lay the Jin dynasty, rulers of northern China, heirs of vast wealth, sprawling cities, and an army said to number more than 1 million. If the Mongols could defeat the Jin, the world would know their power was no mere accident of fortune, but destiny itself. The Jin dynasty had long regarded the steppe tribes as barbarians to be contained. They had built the Great Wall fortifications across their northern border, confident that stone and garrisons could hold back the horsemen. But walls only stop those who fear them, and Genghis Khan had no fear. In the summer of 1211, he gathered perhaps 100,000 warriors, including contingents of Tangut vassals. It was a smaller army than the Jin could muster, but size meant little against discipline and speed. Scouts rode ahead in all directions, mapping terrain, rivers, and fortifications. The Khan's strategy was not to hurl his men recklessly at the wall, but to break the enemy's confidence before breaking their cities. The campaign opened with swift raids across the border. Mongol cavalry struck supply depots, burned fields, and captured small fortresses. Fear spread like wildfire among Jin garrisons. Many soldiers had never faced such relentless foes. Horse archers who appeared from nowhere rained down arrows and vanished before a counterattack could form. At the Battle of Yehuling, the Jin finally sought a decisive engagement. Their generals gathered an army of perhaps 300,000 men, infantry, heavy cavalry, siege units, believing their sheer numbers would crush the nomads. Facing them, Genghis Khan deployed only a fraction of his force, deliberately creating the illusion of weakness. The battle began with the Mongols in retreat, their banners falling back across the dusty plain. The Jin commanders, eager for glory, ordered a massive pursuit. For 9 days, their forces chased the fleeing Mongols, stretching their lines thinner and thinner. Then, at the moment of greatest overextension, the Khan struck. Mongol horns sounded, and hidden reserves swept in from the flanks. What had seemed a retreat was in fact a carefully orchestrated trap. Surrounded, the Jin army crumbled. Tens of thousands were cut down in the chaos, while others drowned in rivers or were trampled beneath the hooves of panicked horses. Chroniclers claimed the ground was slick with blood, the sky dark with arrows. The victory was absolute. The road into northern China now lay open. Genghis Khan advanced relentlessly, targeting one city after another. His army had learned much from the Tanga campaign, and now siege warfare became a regular tool. Captured engineers constructed catapults and siege towers. Prisoners were forced to fill moats with earth or to storm walls ahead of the Mongol cavalry. Terror accompanied the advance. Cities that resisted were slaughtered, while those that surrendered were spared. A brutal lesson that spread faster than any rider. By 1215, the Mongols had reached Zhongdu, the Jin capital, modern-day Beijing. The city's walls stretched high and thick, and its garrison numbered in the tens of thousands. But the defenders were already demoralized. Refugees poured in from the countryside with stories of annihilation. Supplies ran thin. For months, the Mongols encircled the city, cutting off all escape. When Zhongdu finally fell, it was an apocalypse. Chroniclers speak of streets slick with fat, from the countless dead, of buildings reduced to ash, of treasures looted on a scale unmatched in living memory. The Mongols executed officials and generals, but spared artisans, craftsmen, and those useful to the empire. Once again, Genghis Khan showed the ruthless pragmatism that defined his rule. Destruction where resistance was strong, preservation where submission could serve him. Yet the conquest of the Jin was far from complete. Though their capital was destroyed, the dynasty still held power in the south. It would take decades for the Mongols to finish them, and indeed Genghis himself would not live to see the end. But by breaking the northern wall and crushing the Jin armies in the field, he had already achieved something unprecedented. The Khan had proven that the horsemen of the steppe could not only raid, but dismantle the greatest fortifications of China. His reputation spread across Asia like thunder. Muslim chroniclers in Persia, far to the west, began hearing tales of an unstoppable warlord rising in the east. In Europe, traders whispered of barbarian armies that moved like shadows, consuming kingdoms whole. For Genghis Khan, the Jin campaign was more than victory. It was a declaration. The Mongols would not be confined to the steppe. No wall, no army, no empire would stand beyond their reach. As he rode south, the eternal blue sky above him, the Khan already looked to new horizons. Beyond the crumbling Jin lay Central Asia and the great Islamic empires of Persia. Richer still, more formidable still, and they too would learn the price of defiance. By 1218, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to the edge of Central Asia. The Western Xia had submitted. The Jin dynasty was shattered in the north, and the steppe tribes had been forged into a disciplined war machine. Now Genghis Khan turned his eyes westward, toward the flourishing Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Muhammad II. The Khwarezmians were no petty state. Their empire encompassed vast stretches of Persia, Central Asia, and Afghanistan. Its cities, Samarkand, Bokhara, Nishapur, were jewels of Islamic culture, renowned for learning, wealth, and trade. They commanded the Silk Road, and thus the flow of goods and knowledge between East and West. On parchment, the Shah's resources dwarfed those of the Mongols. He commanded perhaps 400,000 troops, with fortified cities and immense treasuries. But Genghis Khan saw both opportunity and danger. Unlike many of his wars, the Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was not born of ambition alone. It began with diplomacy. In 1218, the Khan sent a caravan of 450 Muslim merchants to the Shah's lands, offering trade and peace. "You rule the lands of the setting sun," his letter declared. "I rule those of the rising. Let us be brothers in commerce." For Genghis Khan, it was a test. Would the Shah treat him as an equal? The answer was disastrous. At Otrar, a border governor named Inalchuck accused the caravan of espionage, seized their goods, and executed the merchants. Outraged, the Khan sent ambassadors to demand justice. The Shah's response was worse. He executed the envoys, burning their beards, an unforgivable insult in Mongol culture. When the news reached Genghis Khan, he withdrew into solitude for 3 days, fasting and communing with the eternal blue sky. Emerging at last, his words were cold and measured. "The sovereignty of these lands will pass to my sons, but first I will leave them so desolate that even the hoofs of my horses may dance in their palaces." The vengeance he unleashed was unparalleled. In the spring of 1219, the Khan assembled what may have been the largest Mongol force ever gathered, up to 200,000 warriors. His sons Joki, Shagatai, Ogidii, and Talyui rode with him, each commanding contingents of hardened veterans. Against them, the Shah scattered his vast army across dozens of garrisons, weakening his ability to resist. The invasion began with the city of Otrar, where the insult had first occurred. After a 5-month siege, the walls were breached. Inalchuck, the governor who had murdered the caravan, was captured alive. His punishment was symbolic. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a gruesome tribute to his greed. From there, the Mongols advanced into the heart of Transoxiana. At Bokhara, one of Islam's great cultural centers. Genghis Khan rode into the mosque on horseback. "I am the scourge of God," he declared. "If you had not committed great sins, he would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The city was plundered, its artisans deported, its defenders slaughtered. Survivors were forced to march before the Mongol army to the next target, Samarkand. Samarkand's defenders numbered perhaps 100,000, but morale collapsed at the sight of Bokhar's population driven as human shields. After a brief siege, the city surrendered. Tens of thousands were killed, while the most skilled craftsmen and scholars were sent to Mongolia. The Shah fled westward in panic, abandoning his people. His retreat only deepened the despair of his subjects. One by one, cities fell: Urgench, Nishapur, Herat. At Nishapur, where rebels had killed a Mongol commander who was also the Khan's son-in-law, the retribution was apocalyptic. Chroniclers wrote that the entire population was massacred, with separate piles made of men, women, and children. Even animals were slaughtered. Though the numbers are likely exaggerated, archaeological evidence confirms a scale of destruction that scarred the region for generations. The Shah himself died in exile, sick and broken, on an island in the Caspian Sea in 1220. His empire crumbled in less than 2 years. Cities that had flourished for centuries were left in ruins. Irrigation canals collapsed, turning farmland into desert. The once great Khwarezmian state was erased from the map. Yet amidst the carnage, Genghis Khan showed glimpses of the pragmatism that defined him. Cities that surrendered were often spared, their artisans and scholars relocated rather than killed. Islamic clerics who approached him peacefully were treated with respect, their mosques protected. But resistance meant annihilation. It was this cold balance of terror and tolerance that made Mongol conquest so effective. Perhaps most remarkable was the strategic scope of the campaign. Even as the main armies destroyed Khwarezm, two of the Khan's greatest generals, Subutai and Jeeb, led a detachment of 20,000 on a reconnaissance in force through the Caucasus and into Russia. Over 3 years, they defeated Georgian armies, crushed Alans and Kipchaks, and annihilated a coalition of Russian princes at the Battle of the Kalkar River in 1223. It was a distant prelude to the Mongols' later invasion of Europe, and it showed that the Khan's reach was already continental. The fall of the Khwarezmian Empire was more than a conquest. It was a turning point in world history. Persia and Central Asia were depopulated and devastated, their cultural centers shattered. But in the ashes, a new order arose. The Mongol Empire had extended its grasp into the Islamic world, reshaping the balance of civilizations. For Genghis Khan, the destruction of Khwarezm was both vengeance and warning. To rulers across Eurasia, the message was clear: insult the Mongols, and your kingdom would vanish. Submit, and you might live. By 1221, the Khan turned his armies back east. The Jin still endured in China, and unfinished wars awaited. Yet the memory of Khwarezm would linger for centuries, remembered by Persians as the catastrophe, and by the Mongols as one of their greatest triumphs. While Genghis Khan's armies were dismantling the Khwarezmian Empire brick by brick, two of his most brilliant generals, Subutai the Valiant and Jeeb the Arrow, were entrusted with a mission unlike any the steppe had ever attempted. In 1220, the Khan dispatched them westward with a force of perhaps 20,000 men, a fraction of the Mongol army. Their orders were simple in design, yet staggering in ambition. Scout the lands beyond Khwarezm, punish those who resisted, and return with intelligence about the distant powers of the West. What followed was one of the most audacious military expeditions in medieval history, a 3-year, 5,500-mile campaign that carried Mongol banners through the Caucasus Mountains, across the steppes of southern Russia, and to the very edge of Europe. The campaign began in Central Asia, where Jeeb and Subutai pursued Shah Muhammad's son, Jalal ad-Din, who was attempting to rally resistance after his father's death. Defeated at every turn, Jalal fled into India, leaving the region open. With their immediate task complete, the Mongol generals pressed onward, hungry to test their small force against new lands. Their path led them into the Caucasus, a rugged and mountainous frontier between Asia and Europe. Here, they encountered a coalition of local powers, the Georgians, the Alans, and the Cumans, or Kipchaks. These groups had long fought against each other, but the Mongol presence forced them into uneasy alliance. Subutai and Gebe, masters of political manipulation, immediately set about fracturing it. Through cunning diplomacy, they persuaded the Cumans to abandon their allies, promising spoils and safety. With the coalition weakened, the Mongols struck. In a series of swift battles, they routed the Georgians and Alans, scattering armies that had once stood as bulwarks of Christian defense in the Caucasus. Towns were pillaged, fortresses burned, and word spread that the Mongols were unstoppable. But the Cumans soon realized their mistake. The Mongols showed no loyalty to their temporary allies, and quickly turned on them as well. Betrayed and defeated, the Cumans fled north into the steppes of southern Russia, carrying with them tales of a merciless army that moved like the wind. By 1222, the Mongols had reached the Black Sea. Their small force had cut a swath through peoples who had never before faced such an enemy. Yet Subutai and Gebe were not done. They pursued the Cumans deep into the lands of the Rus principalities. The princes of Kiev, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and others hastily assembled a coalition with the Cumans, determined to drive the invaders back. In May 1223, the two sides met at the Battle of the Kalka River. The Rus-Cuman alliance boasted perhaps 80,000 men, 4 times the Mongol force. Confident in their numbers, the princes advanced aggressively, eager to crush what they believed was a small raiding party. But Subutai and Gebe had prepared their signature weapon, deception. They feigned retreat, drawing the Rus and Cumans into a days-long pursuit across the plains. The coalition forces, strung out and disorganized, eventually stumbled into a carefully laid ambush. At the Khan's signal, the Mongols wheeled around and struck with terrifying precision. Showers of arrows broke enemy ranks, cavalry charges smashed their flanks, and encirclement followed. The Rus princes, unable to coordinate their scattered armies, fell one by one. The result was a massacre. Chroniclers described the riverbanks piled with bodies, the water running red with blood. Several captured princes, including Mstislav of Kiev, were executed in a gruesome display. According to legend, the Mongols placed them beneath wooden planks and feasted atop, crushing their enemies without spilling noble blood, a method considered merciful by steppe tradition, but horrifying to European observers. The victory at Kalka River sent shockwaves across Eastern Europe. A tiny Mongol detachment had annihilated the combined might of the Rus principalities and their steppe allies. Panic spread as far as Hungary and Poland. Yet, astonishingly, the Mongols did not press their advantage. Having completed their reconnaissance mission, Subutai and Gebe turned back east to rejoin the Khan, leaving behind only rumors and fear. This campaign was more than a raid. It was a demonstration of Mongol power and a warning of what was to come. Europe had been touched by the storm, but only its edge. 2 decades later, Subutai would return at the head of a much larger army, leading the full invasion of Hungary and Poland. For now, however, the reconnaissance had achieved its goal. The Mongols had mapped the lands west of the Caspian, tested the armies of Georgia, Russia, and the steppes, and shown that no coalition, no matter how large, could withstand their tactics. The message to Genghis Khan was clear. The West was ripe for conquest. When Subutai and Gebe returned, they found the Khan preparing for new campaigns in China and against the Tanguts. But their intelligence would linger, shaping Mongol strategy for decades. And across Europe, though the Mongols had vanished as suddenly as they appeared, the fear of their return hung like a storm on the horizon. When Subutai and Gebe returned from their audacious western reconnaissance in 1224, they brought intelligence of distant kingdoms, terrifying victories, and the certainty that the Mongols could push as far as Europe itself. But Genghis Khan's gaze had already shifted eastward. He was nearly 60 years old now, yet his ambition was undimmed. Before his life ended, He intended to complete the work that had begun years earlier, the destruction of the Jin dynasty and the final reckoning with the Western Xia. The Jin still clung to power in northern China despite their crushing defeat at Jihuling and the fall of Zhongdu in 1215. They had retreated southward, establishing a new capital at Kaifeng, and though weakened, they remained wealthy and defiant. Their lands were too rich for the Khan to ignore, but a more immediate problem loomed closer. The Tangut kingdom of Western Xia, once humbled into vassalage, had betrayed him. During the long Khwarezmian campaign, the Tanguts had refused to send troops, breaking their pledge of loyalty. Worse still, they had begun plotting with the Jin, hoping to form an anti-Mongol alliance. To Genghis Khan, betrayal was the gravest of sins. Vengeance would come swiftly. In 1226, the Mongol war machine turned south once again, striking into Tangut territory. The campaign was devastating in its precision. The Mongols besieged and destroyed city after city, employing engineers to divert rivers, flood fortifications, and reduce stone walls to rubble. Resistance was punished with massacres. Surrender brought temporary reprieve. Chroniclers describe entire towns burned, their populations scattered across the desert. The Tanguts fought with courage, but they were hopelessly outmatched. Their armies, heavily reliant on infantry and cavalry unsuited to open-steppe warfare, were cut down in ambushes and encirclements. In desperation, Emperor Xiangzong sued for peace, offering submission, but the Khan, remembering their earlier treachery, was unmoved. He demanded complete surrender, even the dismantling of their royal house. Before the Tangut could comply, fate intervened. In early 1227, while directing the siege of Ningxia, Genghis Khan suffered a grave injury. Some accounts say from a fall off his horse. Others claim it was from illness or battle wounds. Whatever the cause, he grew weaker as the campaign pressed on. Yet even on his deathbed, he insisted that the Tanguts be annihilated. "Let their name be erased," he commanded, "so that no seed remains to betray us again." The order was carried out with merciless efficiency. Ningxia fell. The Tangut royal family was executed, their dynasty extinguished. The Western Xia, once proud rulers of desert kingdoms and Silk Road trade, vanished from history. Their language and culture were absorbed into the sands, remembered only in chronicles written by others. As the Tanguts perished, Genghis Khan himself slipped into death. In the summer of 1227, the great conqueror breathed his last beneath the eternal blue sky. His final command fulfilled. His death was kept secret for months, concealed even from much of his army. Messengers announced only that the Khan is hunting, while his generals completed the campaign. The secrecy allowed his empire to remain stable during the vulnerable transition of power. The location of his burial was shrouded in mystery. According to legend, his body was carried back to Mongolia by a loyal escort, who killed anyone who saw the procession to preserve the secret. He was said to be buried near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, the place where he had once found refuge as a boy. His grave has never been found. The legacy of his final campaigns was immense. The Jin still remained, but they were fatally weakened, their northern stronghold shattered. Within a decade, his successors would finish the job, erasing the dynasty entirely. The Tanguts, meanwhile, were gone forever, their name wiped from the map. Genghis Khan had begun life as an outcast boy, abandoned by his clan, hunted and enslaved. He died as the ruler of the largest land empire the world had ever known, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian. His sons and generals inherited not only his vast dominions, but also his vision of expansion. The conquest of China, the Middle East, and Europe would continue under their banners. As the warriors of the steppe mourned in silence, they raised their eyes to the endless sky. The eternal blue sky had taken back its chosen son, but his hoofbeats still thundered in memory. To his people, Genghis Khan was no longer merely a man. He was a force of nature, a storm that had swept across the world and reshaped it forever. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 might have shattered a lesser empire, History is filled with conquerors whose realms collapsed the moment their iron hand was gone. But the Mongol Empire was not built on charisma alone. The Khan had laid down structures of law, loyalty, and meritocracy that outlived him, and he had left clear instructions. His son Ogdi was to succeed him as Great Khan. Ogdi, the third son of Genghis Khan and his chief wife Borte, was not the most celebrated warrior among his brothers. Joki, the eldest, had long been a source of tension due to questions of his paternity, while Chagatai was fierce but notoriously hot-tempered. Talyui, the youngest, had proven himself a brilliant general. Yet Genghis, ever pragmatic, chose Ogdi as his heir. He was steady, diplomatic, and capable of mediating between the fiery personalities of his siblings. For an empire that now spanned continents, stability was as vital as martial skill. The succession was managed with remarkable discipline. Upon Genghis Khan's death, his funeral rites were carried out in secret. Only after the Tanga campaign was complete did his generals and sons convene the Great Kurultai to confirm Ogdi as Great Khan. This transition, though not without private rivalries, ensured continuity of leadership at a critical moment. Ogdi inherited an empire at its height, but also at a crossroads. The Mongols had proven their supremacy on the battlefield, yet the vast territories required administration, infrastructure, and order. The new Great Khan understood that conquest alone could not sustain such a realm. He sought to build on his father's foundations, transforming the Mongol Empire into not just a war machine, but a functioning superstate. One of Ogdi's first acts was to establish a new imperial capital at Karakorum, in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia. What began as a cluster of felt tents soon grew into a permanent city, complete with palaces, temples, marketplaces, and administrative offices. Karakorum became the heart of the empire, a crossroads where merchants, envoys, and scholars from across Eurasia gathered. Here, artisans from China crafted intricate silver fountains, Muslim engineers built stone structures, and European travelers marveled at the diversity of languages and customs. Ogdi also strengthened the YAM system, a network of postal relay stations that stretched across the empire. Every 30 miles, a station provided fresh horses, food, and shelter for imperial couriers. With official passports known as Pesa, Mongol envoys could cross the empire at astonishing speed, covering hundreds of miles in days. This system not only maintained communication between far-flung armies, but also secured trade routes, laying the groundwork for what would later be called the Pax Mongolica. Yet Ogdi was not merely an administrator. He carried forward his father's vision of expansion. The Jin dynasty, though crippled by Genghis Khan's campaigns, still survived in northern China. In 1232, Ogdi personally led the final assault. With the aid of advanced Chinese siege technology, including catapults and gunpowder weapons, the Mongols broke through the Jin defenses. By 1234, the dynasty was destroyed, its last emperor dying in despair as his capital fell. The victory gave the Mongols access to the rich farmlands and immense resources of northern China. Ogdi's armies did not stop there. To the west, the Khwarezmian remnants had regrouped in Persia, but Mongol forces under Talyui and Subutai crushed them once more. Beyond Persia, the Mongols probed deeper into the Middle East, defeating the Seljuk Turks and threatening the gates of Baghdad. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Subutai prepared for the most ambitious invasion yet, a full-scale conquest of the Rus principalities, Hungary, and Poland. Despite these conquests, Ogdi was remembered by his people as a ruler of balance rather than destruction. He continued his father's policy of religious tolerance, granting privileges to Buddhist monks, Muslim clerics, Christian priests, and shamans alike. He systematized taxation, replacing arbitrary plunder with regular levies that allowed conquered populations to rebuild under Mongol oversight. Though heavy, these taxes provided stability that made merchants willing to travel long distances once again. But Ogdi also had his flaws. He was known for indulgence, particularly in alcohol. a habit that would eventually shorten his life. Still, his charisma and fairness made him beloved among his subjects. Chroniclers described him as a man who could weep openly at a comrade's misfortune, yet command with firmness when empire demanded it. By the time of his death in 1241, Ogdi had presided over an empire larger than his father's. From the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary, Mongol banners flew. He had transformed the Mongols from a nomadic confederation into a global empire, one with cities, administration, and a sense of permanence. Yet his death would bring new uncertainty. The empire's unity depended on the succession of a new great Khan, and without Genghis or Ogdi's firm hand, rivalries among his descendants threatened to fracture the vast domain. At the very moment Mongol armies stood on the verge of conquering Europe, news of Ogdi's death would recall them home. For now, however, the world stood in awe. The Mongols were no longer merely conquerors from the steppe. Under Ogdi, they had become the rulers of Eurasia, a force shaping trade, culture, and politics from China to the Mediterranean. The death of Genghis Khan had not ended the storm. Under Ogdi's rule, the Mongol Empire reached new heights of power, and in 1236 the world witnessed a campaign that would carry fear deep into the heart of Europe. The architect of this invasion was Subutai, the brilliant general who had once scouted Russia and defeated the Rus at the Khalkha River. Now he returned with the full weight of Mongol might, accompanied by Bedtime Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Western campaigns. The target was Eastern and Central Europe, a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities, divided by rivalries, yet bound by a shared faith. To the Mongols, these lands were simply the western frontier of their empire in waiting. The advance into Russia, the invasion began with devastating precision. By 1237, Mongol armies swept into the Rus principalities, cities already weakened by years of internal feuds. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, and Moscow fell in quick succession, their wooden walls no match for Chinese-designed siege engines. Entire populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Chroniclers in Kiev recorded firestorms that reduced towns to ash, leaving only smoke rising into the winter sky. In 1240, the Mongols turned on Kiev, the jewel of Rus civilization. For weeks, the defenders resisted, but when the final assault came, the city was crushed in a fury of fire and steel. Churches were torn down, monks slaughtered, nobles executed. What had been one of Europe's great cities became a ruin, its golden domes blackened with soot. From these victories, the Mongols pushed westward into Poland and Hungary. Subutai's strategy was characteristically brilliant. Divide the armies into separate columns, advance across a broad front, and converge at the decisive moment. This tactic spread terror and confusion, making it impossible for defenders to predict the main thrust. The battles of Poland. In 1241, a Mongol force under Baidar and Orda raided into Poland. At the Battle of Legnica-Liegnitz, the Mongols faced a coalition of Polish knights, Teutonic Order warriors, and German crusaders led by Duke Henry the Pious. The European knights charged with their heavy lances, confident in their armor and valor, but the Mongols feigned retreat, luring them into chaos. Clouds of arrows and encirclement followed. By the battle's end, Henry lay dead, his head displayed on a spear. The cream of Poland's nobility was annihilated in a single afternoon. The path to Central Europe now stood open, the invasion of Hungary. While Poland reeled, Subutai led the main army into Hungary. King Bela IV had raised a massive force, bolstered by knights and foreign mercenaries. But Subutai's spies had mapped every river, every ford, every weakness. On April 11th, 1241, at the Battle of Mohi on the Sejo River, the Mongols struck. Subutai had prepared a masterstroke. While one division fixed the Hungarians at a fortified bridge, he led another force across a secret ford, encircling the enemy. The Hungarian camp, crowded with men, horses, and wagons, became a slaughterhouse. Mongol catapults hurled flaming projectiles, arrows fell like rain, and cavalry charges cut through the panicked soldiers. The Hungarian army ceased to exist in a single day. King Bela fled, pursued relentlessly, his kingdom collapsing behind him. Chroniclers described entire villages emptied, corpses left unburied, and the land itself silent, as though no man had lived there. Europe on the brink. By the end of 1241, the Mongols stood poised to march deeper into Europe. Austria, Germany, and even Italy lay within reach. Panic gripped the continent. Papal envoys pleaded for divine aid. Kings scrambled to muster defenses. To many Europeans, it seemed the apocalypse had arrived, heralded by horsemen from the east. And then, as suddenly as the storm had come, it abated. In December 1241, news arrived that Genghis Khan had died in Karakorum. According to Mongol custom, all princes of Genghis Khan's line were required to return for the election of a new great Khan. Batu and Subutai, despite standing on the brink of conquering Europe itself, withdrew. Their armies melted back across the steppes, leaving behind only ruins, ashes, and the memory of terror. The impact. Europe had been spared by chance, not strength. Chroniclers believed it was divine intervention, but in truth it was the Mongol succession system that saved Christendom. Still, the Mongol invasion left profound scars. It shattered the Rus principalities, paving the way for Moscow's eventual rise. It taught European armies that their beloved heavy cavalry was no match for mobile horse archers and combined arms warfare, and it revealed, with brutal clarity, that no land was beyond the reach of the steppe. For Subutai, the invasion was the pinnacle of his genius. He had crushed entire kingdoms, orchestrated multi-front campaigns across thousands of miles, and brought Europe itself to the edge of conquest. Though forced to withdraw, he had demonstrated that the Mongols were not merely raiders, but a force capable of toppling civilizations. As the dust settled, Europe exhaled in relief. But whispers remained. The horsemen would return. And indeed, under later Khans, they would. For the Mongol storm had not yet passed, only paused. The Mongol invasion of Europe ended not with defeat on the battlefield, but with the death of Genghis Khan in December 1241. His passing forced Mongol princes to return to the steppe for the election of a new great Khan, sparing Europe from further devastation. But Genghis' death also marked the beginning of a new phase in Mongol history, one defined not only by conquest, but by succession struggles and fragmentation. For decades, Genghis Khan's descendants had been held together by the authority of the Great Khan in Karakorum. Now, without a unifying hand as firm as Genghis or Genghis, the empire risked splintering. The vast territories, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, were too diverse to be managed from a single center indefinitely. Local rulers began to assert autonomy, and by the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had evolved into four great khanates. The Talyuid Regency. At first, Genghis' widow, Temüjin Khatan, assumed regency, ruling in her husband's name. She maneuvered to secure the throne for her son, Gayuk. In 1246, a great Kurultai assembled, and Gayuk was proclaimed the new great Khan. But Gayuk's reign was short and troubled. He quarreled with Bada Khan, the powerful ruler of the Western Territories, the Golden Horde. Tensions between these cousins threatened civil war, only averted by Gayuk's sudden death in 1248. For a time, the empire held together under regencies, but the seeds of division had already been sown. The rise of four khanates. By the mid-13th century, the empire was effectively divided into four autonomous regions. The Yuan dynasty in China. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, the Mongols completed their conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. Kublai moved the imperial capital to Dadu, modern Beijing, and proclaimed himself emperor of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. This marked a turning point. The Mongols were no longer just conquerors, but also rulers of the world's most sophisticated civilization. The Ilkhanate in Persia. Founded by Hulagu, another grandson of Genghis, the Ilkhanate controlled Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of the Middle East. In 1258, Hulagu captured Baghdad, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate in a conquest that shocked the Islamic world. Though initially shamanist, the Ilkhans gradually converted to Islam, blending Mongol traditions with Persian governance. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. This Khanate, named for Genghis' second son, Chagatai, encompassed Central Asia, including much of modern Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Western China. It remained deeply rooted in steppe traditions, often resisting the sedentary bureaucracies embraced by other Khanates. Internal divisions and rivalries, however, made it one of the most unstable successors. The Golden Horde in Russia, founded by Bedtime Khan, this Khanate ruled over the vast steppes of Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, with its capital at Sarai along the Volga River. The Golden Horde dominated the Rus principalities, forcing them to pay tribute. Though nomadic in character, it gradually became influenced by Islam and Turkic culture, leaving a deep mark on Russian history. Fragmentation and adaptation. Though nominally united under the authority of the Great Khan, each Khanate increasingly pursued its own policies. The distance between Karakorum and the far western territories was simply too great. Communication could take months, and local rulers often ignored central decrees. At the same time, the Khanates adapted to the cultures they ruled. In China, Mongol rulers adopted Confucian-style bureaucracy and patronized Chinese art and science. In Persia, they built Islamic architecture and fostered Persian literature. In Russia, Mongol taxation systems reshaped local politics, indirectly strengthening Moscow's future dominance. This process of cultural adaptation ensured that Mongol influence endured long after political unity faded. The legacy of division, the creation of the four Khanates, did not signal the end of Mongol power. On the contrary, each Khanate remained formidable, often dominating its neighbors for centuries. Yet the unity of the empire was broken. Rivalries between Kublai in China and Hulagu in Persia, or between Batu in Russia and Gayuk in Mongolia, weakened the idea of a single Mongol state. Still, the dream of unity lingered. Successive great Khans, including Monk and Kublai, attempted to reassert authority, but practical control was limited. The Mongol Empire had become less a single state than a federation of great powers, each rooted in a different region of Eurasia. Conclusion: the division of the empire was both inevitable and transformative. The very vastness that made the Mongol conquests legendary also made them impossible to govern as one. Instead, the four Khanates carried forward the legacy of Genghis Khan, blending Mongol traditions with the cultures they ruled. By splitting, the empire lost its political unity, but it gained something else: the diffusion of Mongol influence across Eurasia. From Beijing to Baghdad, from Samarkand to Moscow, the descendants of Genghis Khan reshaped civilizations in ways that would last for centuries. The thunder of hooves had scattered into four different directions, but the echoes still carried across the world. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol storm that had swept across Eurasia was no longer a single front. Instead, it divided into powerful branches, each led by a different descendant of Genghis Khan. Among them was Hulagu Khan, grandson of the great conqueror, entrusted with extending Mongol rule into the Middle East. His campaign would forever alter the Islamic world, culminating in one of the most shocking events of medieval history: the fall of Baghdad in 1258. The march into Persia. In 1251, when Monk Khan, brother of Kublai, became Great Khan, he ordered Hulagu to subdue the Muslim lands of Persia and Mesopotamia. The mission was clear: destroy the sect of the Assassins, crush the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and bring the Middle East into the Mongol fold. Hulagu gathered an army of unprecedented size for the region, perhaps 150,000 strong, including Mongol cavalry, Chinese siege engineers, and subject troops from across Asia. His advance began in Persia, where he dismantled fortresses of the Nizari Ismailis, the famed assassins. Their mountain stronghold at Alamut, once thought impregnable, fell to Mongol siege engines in 1256. With their destruction, a shadow that had haunted Islamic politics for centuries was erased. Now only Baghdad remained, the jewel of the Islamic world, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, and symbol of Muslim unity. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had stood as a center of learning, trade, and faith, its libraries and scholars unrivaled. But in 1258, it would face the fury of Hulagu's horde. The road to Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, underestimated the danger. Believing the Caliphate's prestige would protect him, he ignored Hulagu's demands for submission. Instead, he relied on the city's walls and faith in divine intervention. It was a fatal mistake. In January 1258, Hulagu's army surrounded Baghdad. They built a double ring of fortifications, one facing the city, the other guarding against relief forces. Chinese engineers erected massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones, weighing hundreds of pounds. Day and night, the bombardment rained down, reducing towers and gates to rubble. After 2 weeks, a section of the walls collapsed. Mongol troops poured in. Resistance was fierce, but hopeless. By February 10th, the city surrendered. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in medieval history, the sack of Baghdad. For 7 days, Baghdad was subjected to a massacre unlike anything the city had ever endured. Contemporary chroniclers describe corpses clogging the Tigris River, blood flowing in the streets, and smoke blotting out the sun. Scholars, poets, and citizens alike were slaughtered. The city's fabled House of Wisdom, repository of centuries of scientific and philosophical knowledge, was destroyed. Manuscripts, some containing ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian works, were thrown into the river, which was said to run black with ink. Caliph Al-Mustasim himself met a grim fate. Accounts vary. Some say he was wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, others that he starved in captivity. Whatever the method, his death marked the symbolic end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a temporal power. The Muslim world was stunned. For centuries, Baghdad had been the heart of Islamic civilization. Its fall was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe. Cities across the Middle East trembled, believing the end of days had come. The Mongol advance into Syria. Hulagu pressed onward, bringing Syria under his control. Aleppo and Damascus surrendered, their rulers unable to withstand the storm. By 1260, the Mongols stood at the doorstep of Egypt, threatening the last great Muslim power, the Mamluk Sultanate. The Islamic world seemed on the brink of annihilation, but fate intervened. News reached Hulagu that great Khan monk had died in 1259. Following tradition, he withdrew much of his army to participate in the succession crisis, leaving a smaller force in Syria. This decision would prove costly. In September 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks under Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars confronted the remaining Mongol army. Using tactics that mirrored the Mongols themselves, feigned retreats, ambushes, and cavalry maneuvers, the Mamluks achieved a stunning victory. For the first time, a Mongol advance was decisively halted. Legacy of the Baghdad campaign. The sack of Baghdad marked a turning point in world history. The Abbasid Caliphate never recovered its former power, though later caliphs served as religious figureheads under Mamluk protection in Cairo. The destruction of the city's libraries set back Islamic scholarship for generations, though knowledge preserved elsewhere eventually endured. For the Mongols, Hulagu's campaign created the Ilkhanate, a powerful state that would dominate Persia and Mesopotamia for a century. Over time, the Ilkhans themselves converted to Islam, blending Mongol traditions with Persian Islamic governance. Yet the trauma of 1258 lingered. To Muslims across the world, the sack of Baghdad became a symbol of divine punishment, a warning of arrogance and division. To historians, it marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age, closing a chapter of unparalleled intellectual flourishing. Conclusion: Hulagu had accomplished what no conqueror before him had dared. He ended the Abbasid Caliphate and shattered Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic world. Though the Mongols would eventually be stopped in the Middle East, the memory of that catastrophe shaped Islamic identity for centuries. The thunder of hooves had reached the Tigris, and the river, once carrying the wisdom of ages, ran dark with blood and ink. When Hulagu's horsemen thundered into Baghdad, another grandson of Genghis Khan was preparing to transform the empire in a very different way. Kublai Khan, son of Taluyi and brother of Monk, would shift the Mongol world's center of gravity eastward, away from the steppes and into the heart of China. Under his rule, the Mongols ceased to be wandering conquerors and became emperors of one of history's greatest civilizations, the founders of the Yuan dynasty. The rise of Kublai. Kublai was unlike many of his warrior kin. Born in 1215, he grew up during the height of Mongol expansion, but showed early interest in the cultures of the lands they conquered. He studied Chinese philosophy, employed Confucian scholars as advisors, and learned to balance nomadic traditions with the sophisticated bureaucratic systems of China. When Monk became Great Khan in 1251, he entrusted Kublai with campaigns against the Song dynasty in southern China, the last bastion of Han rule. Kublai distinguished himself as a commander but also as an administrator, winning the loyalty of Chinese officials by easing taxes and restoring farmland devastated by war. His vision was clear. The Mongols could not rule China by force alone. They had to govern it. The conquest of the Song. The war against the Song was long and brutal. Unlike the Jin, whose northern capitals had fallen quickly, the Song were entrenched in the fertile south, protected by rivers, canals, and massive fortified cities. Their navy dominated the waterways, a realm unfamiliar to Mongol horsemen. To break this stalemate, Kublai adopted new strategies. He recruited Chinese and Persian engineers to build powerful siege engines, floating bridges, and warships. Mongol cavalry, once confined to land battles, now learned to fight alongside river fleets. Gradually, city after city fell. The decisive moment came in 1279, at the Battle of Yamen, when Mongol forces surrounded the last Song fleet. The young emperor, only a child, was carried onto a ship by loyal ministers. As Mongol arrows darkened the sky, his guardian leapt into the sea with him, drowning rather than surrendering. With that act, the Song dynasty ended. For the first time in history, all of China was under foreign rule. The Yuan dynasty. In 1271, even before final victory, Kublai declared himself Emperor of China and founded the Yuan dynasty, moving the capital to Dadu, modern Beijing. This was a watershed moment. The Mongols, children of the steppe, now claimed the mandate of heaven. The Yuan dynasty blended Mongol and Chinese traditions. At the top stood Kublai and his family, maintaining Mongol dress, customs, and military culture. Below them, he retained much of the Confucian bureaucracy, ensuring the machinery of governance continued. Yet society was stratified. Mongols occupied the highest tier, followed by Central Asians, then Northern Chinese, with Southern Chinese at the bottom. This hierarchy sowed resentment, but it allowed Kublai to balance loyalty within his diverse empire. Achievements of Kublai's rule. Despite tensions, Kublai's reign brought remarkable achievements. Infrastructure. The Yuan repaired and expanded the Grand Canal, ensuring grain from the south could feed the capital in the north. Roads, postal stations, and relay systems knit China into the larger Mongol world. Economy. Kublai promoted trade along the Silk Road and maritime routes. Merchants flourished under Mongol protection, and markets bustled with goods from Persia, India, and even Europe. Paper money. The Yuan government pioneered the widespread use of paper currency, backed by Mongol authority, which facilitated large-scale commerce. Though inflation became a problem later, at its peak it symbolized innovation and state control. Culture and exchange. Kublai welcomed foreign visitors. Most famous among them was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who served at Kublai's court for years. His tales of the empire's wealth and wonders astonished Europe, inspiring generations of explorers. Challenges and failures. Yet Kublai's empire faced serious challenges. The Mongols remained outsiders in the eyes of many Chinese. Heavy taxation, corruption, and favoritism toward foreigners fueled resentment. revolts simmered beneath the surface. Kublai also pursued costly expansion. He launched massive naval expeditions against Japan in 1274 and 1281. Both failed catastrophically when typhoons, later called the kamikaze, or divine winds, destroyed the invasion fleets. Campaigns in Vietnam and Java met similar disasters, draining resources and eroding Mongol invincibility. As Kublai aged, grief and indulgence weakened him. He lost his beloved wife Chabi and his chosen heir, leading to bitter succession disputes. By his death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty controlled a vast and wealthy empire, but cracks had begun to appear. Legacy. Kublai Khan left behind a paradox. He was both the embodiment of the steppe conqueror and the Chinese emperor. His dynasty ruled China for nearly a century, reshaping its institutions and connecting it to the wider world. Yet by adopting Chinese systems, the Mongols lost much of the fierce nomadic spirit that had forged their empire. For China, the Yuan period was one of turbulence and exchange, a time when Mongol horsemen ruled from the Forbidden City and caravans carried ideas across Eurasia. For the Mongols, it was both triumph and transformation, the moment they ceased to be wanderers and became emperors. When the thunder of hooves first shook the forests of Eastern Europe in the 1240s, few realized that the impact would last not for years, but for centuries. The Mongol invasion of the Russian principalities, Poland, and Hungary was only the beginning. From those campaigns emerged a powerful successor state to Genghis Khan's empire, the Golden Horde. For nearly 250 years, it shaped the destinies of Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus, leaving an imprint still visible in the political culture of Eastern Europe. The birth of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was founded by Bata Khan, son of Joki and grandson of Genghis Khan, after the devastating campaign into Eastern Europe, 1236 to 1242. Bata withdrew his armies to the lower Volga River, where he established his capital at Sarai, a city that would become one of the largest in medieval Eurasia. From there, he and his successors ruled a vast realm stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to Siberia. The name Golden Horde likely derives from the Mongol word orda, camp or court, combined with the gold that symbolized Bata's royal tent. To contemporaries, it represented both awe and fear. A steppe empire that had subdued the mighty Rus princes and could project power deep into Europe. Rule over the Rus. Perhaps the most famous legacy of the Golden Horde was its domination of the fragmented Russian principalities. After the sack of Kiev in 1240, the princes of Novgorod, Vladimir, Moscow, and other states became vassals of the Khans. They were forced to pay heavy tribute and seek formal approval, or yarliks, from Sarai to rule their territories. This system of overlordship reshaped Russian politics. Local princes competed fiercely for Mongol favor, traveling long distances to Sarai to bow before the Khans. The Mongols did not rule directly but extracted wealth through tribute collectors, often leaving Orthodox church lands exempt from taxation. Over time, the church grew stronger as a result, playing a central role in preserving Russian identity. One city, however, benefited more than others, Moscow. Its princes became reliable tribute gatherers for the horde. In return, they received privileges that allowed them to expand their influence. This collaboration inadvertently set the stage for Moscow's eventual rise as the heart of a unified Russia, even as it remained under the Horde's shadow for centuries. Life in the Golden Horde. Contrary to the stereotype of Mongols as mere raiders, the Golden Horde developed a vibrant and prosperous state. Sarai, located along the Volga, became a cosmopolitan hub. Archaeological excavations reveal grand palaces, bustling markets, mosques, and Orthodox churches, reflecting the Horde's religious tolerance. Merchants from Italy, Persia, Central Asia, and beyond traded in furs, silk, spices, and slaves. The Horde's economy relied heavily on controlling the great trade routes that linked China to Europe. Genoese and Venetian traders established colonies on the Black Sea. paying tribute to the Mongols in exchange for safe passage. This flourishing commerce was part of the broader Pax Mongolica, which allowed goods and ideas to flow across Eurasia. Conversion to Islam. Initially, the Golden Horde's rulers maintained traditional Mongol shamanic beliefs or Buddhism, but by the mid-13th century, a major shift occurred. Berk Khan, Bada's brother and successor, converted to Islam around 1257. This decision altered the Horde's identity, aligning it more closely with the Islamic world. The conversion had immediate political consequences. Berk forged alliances with the Mamluks of Egypt, united by their common opposition to Hulagu's Ilkhanate in Persia, which had destroyed Baghdad. For the first time, the Mongol Empire fractured along religious as well as political lines. Muslim Golden Horde versus Buddhist, and later, partly Christian, Ilkhanate. Islamization also transformed the Horde internally. Mosques were built in Sarai. Islamic law-influenced administration, and many Turkic tribes under Horde control embraced the new faith. Over time, the Mongol elite themselves became culturally Turkicized, merging with the populations they ruled. Decline and fragmentation. Despite its strength, the Golden Horde faced the same challenges that weakened all Mongol successor states: succession disputes, economic strain, and external rivals. By the 14th century, the Horde's power began to waver. The Black Death devastated its cities and trade routes, depopulating vast areas. At the same time, the princes of Moscow grew increasingly assertive. The turning point came in 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, when Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow defeated a Horde army led by the warlord Mamai. Though the Horde soon reasserted control under Toktamish, the battle became a symbol of Russian resistance. By the 15th century, the Golden Horde splintered into rival khanates: the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, the Astrakhan Khanate, and the Siberian Khanate. Each carried forward elements of Mongol rule, but lacked the unifying strength of the original Horde. Meanwhile, Moscow steadily expanded, defeating the Horde at the Ugra River in 1480, an event often called the end of the Mongol yoke in Russia. Legacy of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde disappeared as a political entity, but its influence endured. Russian autocracy, centralized tribute systems, and patterns of diplomacy all bore the imprint of Mongol overlordship. The rise of Moscow as the nucleus of the Russian state was in part made possible by its role as tribute collector for the Khans. Culturally, the Horde accelerated the spread of Islam and Turkic languages across Central Asia and the Volga region, shaping the identities of modern-day Kazakhstan, Tatarstan, and other regions. The Crimean Khanate, a successor state, would survive into the 18th century, playing a key role in Eastern European politics until it was annexed by Catherine the Great. In the end, the Golden Horde represented the duality of Mongol rule, devastation and subjugation on one hand, but also connectivity, commerce, and cultural exchange on the other. For Russia and Eastern Europe, its shadow was long and complex, a reminder of the centuries when Mongol horsemen dictated the fates of Christian princes and reshaped the map of the region. When the Mongol armies thundered into Persia in the early 13th century, they left a trail of destruction so complete that many contemporaries believed civilization itself had ended. Cities like Nishapur, Herat, and Baghdad were reduced to ruins, their libraries burned, their populations massacred. Yet from this devastation rose a new Mongol state, the Ilkhanate, that would reshape the Islamic world, blending Mongol traditions with Persian culture and ultimately sowing the seeds of a renaissance. The birth of the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate was founded by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of Great Khan Monk and Kublai. In 1255, Monk tasked Hulagu with extending Mongol power into the Middle East. His mission was twofold: to crush the assassins, the feared Nizari Ismaili sect entrenched in their mountain fortresses, and to topple the Abbasid Caliphate, the symbolic heart of the Islamic world. Hulagu's campaigns were ruthless and effective. By 1256, the assassins had been destroyed, their impregnable castles overrun one by one. Then came the fateful march on Baghdad in 1258. Despite the city's reputation as the jewel of the world, its walls proved no match for Mongol siege engines and Chinese engineers. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was captured and executed, allegedly rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses. For the Islamic world, the fall of Baghdad marked the end of an era. For the Mongols, it marked the birth of a new dynasty. From conquest to governance, Hulagu declared himself Il Khan, subordinate Khan, acknowledging the Great Khan in Mongolia, though in practice the Ilkhanate ruled independently. His realm encompassed Persia, Iraq, and much of Anatolia, but ruling this vast and devastated territory required more than conquest. The Mongols, though feared warriors, had little experience with the complex bureaucracy and agrarian economy of the Middle East. They initially relied on military governors and heavy tribute, but this only deepened resentment among their Muslim subjects. Over time, the Il Khans adopted Persian administrators and began to integrate themselves into the region's traditions. Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, was a city of trade. Karakorum in Mongolia was a nomadic court, but the Ilkhanate chose Tabriz as its main capital, strategically placed on trade routes and close to fertile agricultural lands. Here, Mongol rulers began to blend steppe traditions with Persian Islamic urban life. The question of religion became a defining issue for the Ilkhanate. Initially, Hulagu and his successors were Buddhists or shamanists, while their subjects were overwhelmingly Muslim. This religious divide bred deep tensions, especially after Hulagu allied with Christian powers against Muslim Mamluks of Egypt. The turning point came with Genghis Khan, r. 1295 to 1304. Raised a Buddhist, Genghis converted to Islam upon taking power, making the Ilkhanate a Muslim state. His conversion was not just a personal decision, but a political necessity. It secured the loyalty of his Persian subjects and ended decades of hostility between Mongol rulers and their Muslim populace. Genghis enforced Islamic law alongside the Yasa, patronized mosques, and rebuilt cities devastated by earlier conquests. His reign marked a cultural flowering. Persian historians, such as Rashid al-Din, thrived under his patronage. Rashid's monumental Jami al-Tawarik, Compendium of Chronicles, was one of the world's first global histories, incorporating accounts of Europe, China, and India as well as the Islamic world. It reflected the cosmopolitan spirit of the Ilkhanate, where knowledge flowed freely across conquered lands. Cultural renaissance amid ruins. Though the Mongols had initially destroyed much of Persia's infrastructure, by the late 13th century the Ilkhanate oversaw a remarkable recovery. Canals were repaired, agriculture revived, and trade along the Silk Road flourished. Artisans were brought from China, Central Asia, and even Europe, resulting in unique artistic fusions. Chinese dragons twined across Persian ceramics, while European influences appeared in miniature painting. Architecture flourished as well. The city of Sultaniya, built by Al-Jadu, became a showcase of Ilkhanate ambition. Its massive mausoleum, crowned by one of the largest brick domes in the world, still stands as a testament to the dynasty's grandeur. The Ilkhanate also played a vital role in the exchange of technology and ideas. Papermaking, astronomical instruments, and medical knowledge passed between East and West under Mongol protection. Scholars debated philosophy in Tabriz, while merchants carried spices, silk, and silver across Eurasia. Decline and dissolution. Yet the Ilkhanate's achievements could not shield it from the same forces that undermined other Mongol states. Succession disputes plagued the dynasty after the death of Abu Sa'idi in 1335. Without a strong central authority, rival warlords and local dynasties carved up the territory. Persia fell into chaos, with new powers like the Jalayirids and later Temurids rising from the Ilkhanate's ruins. By the mid-14th century, the Il Khans were gone, their dynasty extinguished, but their impact endured. The Persian bureaucratic and cultural revival under Mongol rule laid the groundwork for future Islamic empires, while their integration into Islam reshaped Mongol identity itself. The Ilkhanate's legacy. The Ilkhanate was a paradox, born from destruction, yet responsible for cultural rebirth. It toppled the Abbasid Caliphate, yet paved the way for Persian intellectual and artistic revival. It brought Mongols and Muslims into a fraught but ultimately transformative encounter. In the words of Rashid al-Din, "The world is one garden, and the different peoples are its plants." The Ilkhanate, in all its contradictions, embodied that vision, a garden born of fire, watered by blood, yet flowering into something enduring. Of all Genghis Khan's descendants, none would leave a greater mark on world history than Kublai Khan. While the Mongol conquests had reshaped Asia and Europe, it was under Kublai that the Mongols transformed from nomadic conquerors into emperors of one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, China. His reign marked both the pinnacle of Mongol power and the beginning of their gradual assimilation into the very cultures they once sought to dominate. The rise of Kublai. Kublai was born in 1215, the grandson of Genghis Khan and son of Temüjin. Unlike many of his relatives raised entirely on the steppe, Kublai grew up with exposure to Chinese culture. He studied Confucian classics, consulted Buddhist monks, and invited scholars from across Eurasia to his court. This broad outlook gave him a unique perspective. He admired the sophistication of sedentary civilizations while still carrying the legacy of the steppe warrior ethos. In 1251, when his brother monk became Great Khan, Kublai was appointed governor of northern China. Here, he demonstrated both military ability and administrative talent. He encouraged agricultural reforms, reduced taxes to win local support, and employed Chinese advisors alongside Mongol commanders. His approach differed sharply from the traditional Mongol practice of harsh extraction, signaling his ambition to rule not just as a conqueror, but as a legitimate emperor. Conquest of the Song. The southern Song dynasty, based in Hangzhou, had long resisted northern invaders. Rich, populous, and technologically advanced, it posed the greatest challenge to Mongol expansion. Beginning in the 1250s, Kublai launched campaigns against the Song, combining Mongol cavalry with Chinese siege engineers and naval forces. The decisive moment came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen. A massive Song fleet, commanded by loyalist generals, was surrounded and annihilated by Mongol forces. The last Song emperor, a child, was drowned at sea. For the first time in centuries, all of China was unified under foreign rule. With victory complete, Kublai declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, moving the capital from Karakorum in Mongolia to Khanbaliq, modern Beijing. He proclaimed himself not just Great Khan of the Mongols, but also Emperor of China, adopting the dynastic title Yuan to signal legitimacy in the eyes of his Chinese subjects. Ruling China. Ruling China was unlike ruling the steppe. The empire Kublai inherited contained millions of farmers, an entrenched Confucian bureaucracy, and sophisticated traditions of governance. To control it, he created a hybrid system. The Yuan dynasty preserved many Mongol institutions, such as the decimal military organization and the privileged status of the Mongol elite, but it also adopted Chinese systems of taxation, bureaucracy, and rituals of imperial rule. Kublai organized society into a strict hierarchy. At the top were Mongols, below them, other non-Chinese peoples such as Central Asians. Next came Northern Chinese, and at the bottom, the Southern Chinese of the conquered Song. This hierarchy ensured Mongol dominance, but also sowed resentment among the native majority. Kublai invested heavily in infrastructure. He expanded the Grand Canal, built roads, and improved postal relay stations, YAM, that linked the empire from Korea to Tibet. He supported printing and paper currency, promoting trade across Eurasia. His court became a cosmopolitan hub where Persians, Arabs, Tibetans, and Europeans mingled with Chinese scholars. The court of Kublai. Kublai's court at Khanbaliq was a dazzling symbol of the empire's wealth and diversity. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who visited in the 1270s, described a city of vast palaces, bustling markets, and intricate canals. Though some of his accounts were exaggerated, they reflected genuine marvels: paper money backed by state authority, an efficient postal system, and an empire open to merchants from distant lands. The Yuan court also became a center for cultural and religious exchange. Kublai patronized Buddhism, supported Taoist institutions, and tolerated Christianity and Islam. This pluralism made his capital a microcosm of Eurasia, unmatched in diversity, struggles and failures. Yet Kublai's reign was not without challenges. His military campaigns beyond China largely failed. 2 invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 ended in disaster, the latter destroyed by typhoons the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine winds. Campaigns in Vietnam, Java, and Burma also faltered against tropical climates and determined resistance. These costly failures drained the empire's treasury and weakened the aura of Mongol invincibility. At home, tension simmered, the hierarchy that privileged Mongols over Chinese bred resentment. The heavy reliance on paper money led to inflation. Floods, famine, and disease compounded unrest. Though Kublai's reign was stable, after his death in 1294 the Yuan dynasty faced growing rebellions that would eventually lead to its downfall. Legacy of the Yuan. Kublai Khan's rule left a profound legacy. For China, the Yuan dynasty marked the first time the entire empire was ruled by outsiders, reshaping Chinese identity and politics. For the Mongols, it marked their transformation from nomadic conquerors to emperors of a settled, agrarian civilization. The Yuan period was one of cultural fusion. Persian astronomy informed Chinese science, Middle Eastern medicine mingled with Chinese practices, and artistic styles blended across continents. Yet it also exposed the limits of Mongol adaptability. The empire that had thrived on horseback struggled to maintain unity, once settled in palaces. Kublai himself embodied this contradiction. The grandson of a nomadic conqueror who became the emperor of the world's oldest sedentary civilization. His reign represented both the triumph and the beginning of the decline of Mongol power. From the thundering hooves of conquest emerged something unexpected: peace. By the mid-13th century, under the descendants of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, creating the largest contiguous empire in history. For all its violence, the Mongol expansion produced a unique phenomenon historians call the Pax Mongolica, a century-long period of unprecedented stability, commerce, and cultural exchange across Eurasia. What was the Pax Mongolica? The phrase means Mongol peace. Just as the Pax Romana once unified the Mediterranean world, the Mongol peace created a vast zone of security across Eurasia. Before the Mongols, merchants and travelers on the Silk Road faced countless dangers: bandits, shifting borders, corrupt officials, and warring states. After the Mongols unified these regions, roads became safer, trade routes were restored, and communication networks flourished. Contemporaries marveled that a maiden carrying a nugget of gold could walk unmolested from one end of the empire to the other. While exaggerated, it captured the sense of order enforced by Mongol law. The Yam system, a communication revolution. At the heart of this stability lay the Yam, the Mongol postal relay system. Stations were established every 25 to 30 miles along major routes, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and shelter. Couriers bearing the Khan's peza, a tablet of authority, could demand supplies, ensuring they could cover hundreds of miles in a single day. This system allowed rulers in Karakoram or Khanbalik to send commands across continents in weeks rather than months. It also served merchants and envoys, who could travel safely with official backing. In many ways, the Yam was a medieval precursor to modern logistics networks. Trade on a global scale. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road reached its peak. Luxury goods such as silk, porcelain, and tea traveled westward from China, while silver, wool, and glassware flowed eastward from Europe and the Middle East. Spices from India, gems from Central Asia, and furs from Russia moved along caravan routes, enriching merchants across continents. The Mongols taxed trade heavily but fairly, encouraging commerce rather than plunder. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa established colonies on the Black Sea, linking European markets directly to Mongol-controlled routes. For the first time, a continuous line of trade connected East Asia to Europe under one political framework: cultural and intellectual exchange. Goods were not the only things to move along these routes. Ideas, technologies, and religions spread with remarkable speed. Gunpowder and printing traveled west from China, transforming European warfare and communication. Persian astronomy and medicine influenced Chinese science, while Chinese cartography enriched Islamic scholarship. Missionaries from many faiths, Nestorian Christians, Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, moved freely, often protected by the Khans. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din compiled a world history that included accounts from China, India, and Europe, unthinkable before the Mongol era. The Mongols themselves were religiously tolerant. Genghis Khan had declared that all religions should be respected, and his descendants upheld this principle. In cities like Karakoram and Sarai, mosques stood beside Christian churches, Buddhist temples, and shamanist shrines. This atmosphere encouraged dialogue across faiths at a time when much of the world was divided by religious conflict. The journey of Marco Polo. The most famous beneficiary of the Pax Mongolica was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. Traveling with his family across Asia, Polo reached the court of Kublai Khan and spent nearly 2 decades in Yuan, China. His travels, written after his return to Europe, introduced Europeans to paper money, coal, grand canals, and the splendor of Chinese civilization. Though scholars debate the accuracy of his account, it captured the essence of the era, a world temporarily connected, where European merchant could serve at the court of a Mongol emperor in Beijing. The dark side, plague and fragility, yet the same networks that spread trade and culture also spread disease. The Black Death, likely originating in Central Asia, traveled along Mongol trade routes to the Middle East and Europe. By the 1340s, the plague had killed tens of millions, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population, and devastated Asia as well. The Mongol peace also proved fragile, as succession disputes fractured the empire into separate khanates: the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. The seamless unity of the Silk Road began to unravel. Banditry reemerged, wars flared between rival khans, and merchants once again faced uncertainty. Legacy of the Pax Mongolica. Though short-lived, the Pax Mongolica had lasting effects. It was the first true global age, when goods and ideas flowed across continents on a massive scale. It brought together distant civilizations, exposed Europe to Asian innovations, and laid the groundwork for the later age of exploration, when Europeans sought sea routes to replace disrupted land networks. For a brief moment in history, the Mongols turned conquest into connectivity, creating a world more interconnected than ever before. Their empire may have faded, but the global links forged during the Pax Mongolica permanently altered the trajectory of human civilization. Every empire carries within it the seeds of its own decline. For the Mongols, whose empire stretched across Eurasia like no other before or since, those seeds took the form of succession disputes, cultural divisions, and the inherent challenge of ruling vast, diverse populations. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the once unified Mongol world began to fracture as civil wars and rival khanates tore apart the empire founded by Genghis Khan. The succession problem. The Mongol system of succession was never clearly defined. Leadership was supposed to be determined by the Kurultai, a grand assembly of nobles. But in practice, powerful families maneuvered for dominance, and consensus proved increasingly elusive as the empire grew. When Monk Khan died in 1259, during a campaign in China, a power struggle erupted between his brothers Kublai and Erik Bok. Kublai, commanding forces in China, had the wealth of the Song conquest behind him. Erik Bok, based in Karakoram, had the support of traditional steppe aristocrats. Their civil war, 1260 to 1264, split the empire. Though Kublai ultimately triumphed, declaring himself Great Khan and founding the Yuan dynasty in China, the unity of the Mongol world was irreparably damaged. Fragmentation into four khanates. By the late 13th century, the empire had effectively divided into four major khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, under Kublai and his successors. The Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, founded by Hulagu. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, ruled by descendants of Genghis's son Chagatai. The Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppes, ruled by descendants of Jochi. Though all acknowledged the symbolic authority of the Great Khan, in reality they pursued independent policies, often allying with or fighting against one another. Wars between khanates. The Mongol civil wars were not mere family quarrels. They reshaped Eurasian geopolitics. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde became bitter enemies, divided not only by politics, but also religion. After Berk Khan of the Horde converted to Islam, he clashed with Hulagu's Ilkhanate, which initially followed Buddhism. Their wars ravaged the Caucasus and weakened both states. Meanwhile, the Chagatai Khanate often wavered between alliances with one side or the other, depending on shifting leadership. In China, the Yuan dynasty's focus on ruling a sedentary empire alienated steppe nobles, who accused Kublai of abandoning Mongol traditions. Cultural and religious divisions. The unity of the early empire had rested on a flexible meritocracy and tolerance, but over time divisions hardened. The Ilkhanate became deeply Islamic after Ghazan Khan's conversion in 1295. The Golden Horde also Islamized, aligning itself with the wider Muslim world. The Yuan dynasty, by contrast, absorbed Chinese bureaucratic and Confucian traditions, alienating Mongol elites who saw this as betrayal of steppe ways. The Chagatai Khanate became a patchwork, with parts leaning toward Islam and others resisting it. These diverging cultural paths meant that by the 14th century, the four khanates no longer shared a common vision. The role of the Black Death. The Black Death in the mid-14th century accelerated the empire's fragmentation. Trade routes that had once flourished under the Pax Mongolica became conduits for plague, devastating populations across Eurasia. Depopulation disrupted economies and reduced the tax revenues khanates depended upon. Cities shrank, farmlands went untilled, and rebellion simmered. Military decline. The Mongols' extraordinary military machine, forged on the steppe, also began to erode. As khans and princes settled in palaces, they lost the horsemanship and discipline that had once made them unstoppable. Their enemies, meanwhile, adapted. States like the Mamluks in Egypt and the rising powers of Europe learned Mongol tactics and developed gunpowder weapons, narrowing the gap in battlefield advantage. The final unraveling. By the 14th century, the Great Khan in China was largely irrelevant to the other khanates. The Ilkhanate collapsed after 1335 into local dynasties. The Golden Horde splintered into smaller khanates, such as Kazan, Crimea, and Astrakhan. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. Even in Mongolia itself, power waned as local tribes reasserted independence. The dream of a unified Mongol world, one empire stretching from the Pacific to the Danube, was gone. Yet the Mongol legacy lived on in each region. Islamic Persia, Muscovite Russia, and Yuan China all bore the imprint of Mongol rule. Legacy of division. The decline of unity did not erase the Mongols' impact. The khanates continued to facilitate trade, spread ideas, and influence governance. But their fragmentation meant that Eurasia returned to a multipolar world of competing states. For the peoples once ruled by the Khans, the Mongol era remained both a memory of terror and a foundation of new political orders. What had begun with the vision of Genghis Khan, one ruler, one law, one empire under the eternal blue sky, ended in rivalry, division, and assimilation. The Mongols had conquered the world, but they could not conquer time. The Mongol Empire no longer exists on maps. Its capitals long turned to ruins, and its khans remembered more in legend than in power. Yet the echoes of their hoofbeats still reverberate across our world today. From the languages we speak to the borders we draw, from the genes in our bodies to the institutions of our governments, The Mongols left an indelible mark on human history. The end of their empire was not the end of their influence. It was the beginning of its transformation. Political legacies. The Mongols revolutionized governance. Genghis Khan's meritocracy, promoting leaders based on loyalty and ability rather than noble birth, reshaped ideas of authority. In Russia, the tribute collecting system under the Golden Horde centralized power in Moscow, laying foundations for the rise of the Russian state. In China, the Yuan dynasty's fusion of steppe traditions with Confucian bureaucracy created a model later studied and adapted by the Ming. Even in Persia, Mongol reforms influenced the Safavids and Ottomans, embedding a tradition of tax systems and census-based governance. Though their empire fragmented, the Mongols introduced structures of rule that endured long after their khanates vanished. Cultural and religious exchange. The Mongols were unusual conquerors, tolerant of religions, open to new ideas, and willing to absorb foreign expertise. Their empire became the first great multicultural superhighway. Under their rule, Muslims debated Buddhists in Karakoram, Christian envoys dined with Mongol Khans, and Jewish scholars advised rulers. This pluralism left traces everywhere. In China, Islamic astronomy shaped Yuan observatories. In Persia, Chinese art influenced Persian miniatures. Across Eurasia, styles of architecture, clothing, and literature blended into new forms. Even European art and literature absorbed distant influences, carried back by travelers like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Economic impact. The Pax Mongolica created the first true global economy. Merchants, freed from the dangers of fragmented borders, carried silk, spices, silver, and ideas across thousands of miles. Genoese traders on the Black Sea linked Europe with Asia in ways that paved the path for the age of exploration. When overland routes declined with the Mongols' fall, Europeans sought sea routes to Asia, launching the voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan. In this sense, the Mongols indirectly set the stage for the modern globalized world. The dark shadow, plague, and destruction. The Mongol legacy is not only one of exchange and innovation. Their conquests caused catastrophic destruction. Cities burned, populations massacred, irrigation systems ruined. The Black Death, carried along Mongol trade routes, killed tens of millions, reshaping demographics and economies worldwide. For many regions, the Mongols remain remembered as destroyers as much as unifiers. Yet even devastation created new beginnings. Depopulated lands became pastures. Weakened empires gave rise to new powers. Out of destruction came transformation, genetic and demographic legacy. Modern genetic studies reveal a startling fact. Around 8% of men across a vast region of Asia share a Y chromosome lineage believed to descend from Genghis Khan and his male relatives. That means roughly 16 million men alive today may carry the genetic imprint of the Mongol elite. The empire's demographic upheavals reshaped entire populations, mixing Turkic, Persian, Mongol, Slavic, and Chinese communities in ways that defined Central Asia and beyond. Memory and identity. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero, his image emblazoned on currency, airports, and vodka bottles. For Russians, the Mongol yoke remains a contested historical memory, viewed either as a period of oppression or as formative in shaping Russian autocracy. In China, the Yuan dynasty is part of the long dynastic continuum, sometimes remembered as foreign oppressors, sometimes as legitimate emperors. In Central Asia, nations like Kazakhstan trace parts of their identity to steppe traditions, crystallized during Mongol rule. Thus, the Mongols remain not just history but heritage, claimed, contested, and reinterpreted by different peoples. The greatest lesson, perhaps the greatest legacy of the Mongols, lies in their paradox. They were destroyers and creators, warriors and administrators, outsiders who became rulers. They shattered worlds, but also stitched them together. Their empire was brief, but the networks it created changed the trajectory of human history. In many ways, the Mongols gave the medieval world its first taste of globalization. They demonstrated the power of connectivity and the dangers that come with it. The lessons of their rise and fall still resonate in our era of interconnected economies and fragile peace. Closing reflection. As dawn breaks over the endless Mongolian steppe, the land looks much as it did in the 12th century. Rolling grasslands beneath the eternal blue sky. It was from this simplicity that one man, Genghis Khan, rose to build the greatest land empire the world has ever known. Though the political structure he created has long vanished, the world it forged endures, in trade routes reborn, in cultures blended, in identities shaped, and in the shared memory of humanity. The Mongols disappeared as rulers, but not as forces of history. Their legacy lives on, invisible yet immense, an empire without borders, echoing still in the hoofbeats of the past.